There is a kind of quiet that a forest makes when nothing living is left inside it to breathe. I have stood in that quiet more times than I care to count, in the middle of the Trebich, with my rifle gone cold in my hands and my own heartbeat suddenly very loud. And I have understood in a way that has nothing to do with reason, that the trees around me were not empty. They were only holding still. That is how I want to begin, before I tell you my name, before I tell you the things that have happened in my country and go on happening to this day. I want you to feel, for one moment, the thing that I feel every single time I cross that tree line. The silence out there is not the absence of something. The silence out there is a held breath. My name is Radim, and I am what you might call a park ranger, here in my home country of Slovakia. I am writing to you, and I am speaking to you now, because I want to explain something that is happening in my country, and that is happening in one particular place, and that no one who lives near it will look at directly for very long. It is easier, you understand, to look at the edges of a thing. It is easier to shrug. I have spent a great many years learning how difficult it is to make a person look at the center. For some backstory, Slovakia is a small country in the very middle of Europe. The biggest mountains here are the Carpathians, that long gray spine of stone that curves through half a dozen nations, and the Trebich is a part of the Carpathians. If you found it on a map, you would pass over it without a second glance. The Trebich is a relatively small range, not very high, worn down by more centuries than a human mind can hold, and it sits in the shape of a rough triangle on the western side of the country. 3 points, 3 long ridgelines closing in on a hollow heart of forest. I have thought a great deal over the years about that triangle, and about how the people who came before us always seem to know that certain shapes hold certain things. We have far more dangerous mountains here than the Trebich. The Tatras rise like broken teeth in the north, and they are truly deadly, but they are deadly in ways that make sense to a rational man. The weather in the Tatras will turn on you inside a single hour. Rock slides come down without warning and bury a trail that was clear a moment before. There are wild animals with claws and appetites, and every year the Tatras take a few of the careless and the unlucky, and every year we understand exactly how and exactly why. That is the important thing. We understand. The Trebich is not like that. The climate there is moderate and mild. There are no tornadoes. There are no earthquakes. The slopes are gentle enough that a grandmother could climb them on a summer afternoon, and the streams run clean. And in June the light comes down green and gold through the beech leaves, and it looks, to any visitor, like the calmest and most ordinary place in the whole of Central Europe. It looks like a postcard. It looks like nothing at all could ever happen there. But it is not calm, and it is not ordinary. Not for everyone. Not for the ones it chooses. The Trebich is a very dangerous place, and I say that as a man whose entire adult life has been spent walking its trails, marking its trees, and pulling the occasional lost hiker out of a hollow before nightfall. There is a whole series of missing people in the Trebich. People who walked into those beech woods on an ordinary day and were never seen alive again, and whose bodies, in a certain small and terrible number of cases, were never found at all. Not a bone, not a boot, not a scrap of cloth caught on a branch. Nothing. Now I want to be honest with you because I am a rational person and I want you to trust me. Most of the disappearances in the Trebich can be explained. I believe that with all my heart, or at least I have made myself believe it. The way a man makes himself believe the floor will hold when he steps out of bed in the total blackness of a winter morning. The Trebich is old, and old forests have wolves, and they have bears, and a bear that is startled or hungry or protecting its young will do things to a human body that make that body very difficult to find afterward. Scavengers scatter what is left. The soft ground and the leaf litter and the running water do the rest. Most of the missing, I tell myself, are tragic accidents. Ordinary predators and ordinary bad luck. But there are other cases. There are cases that will not lie down inside that explanation no matter how firmly I press them. There are cases where the ordinary answers slide off the surface of the thing like rainwater off oiled leather, and what is left underneath is something that I do not have a word for, and that I am not sure I want to find a word for. The Trebich disappearances have become a kind of joke here, a piece of folklore, an urban legend that people trade the way people everywhere trade stories that frighten them just enough to feel alive. Almost like your Bermuda Triangle. Someone even coined the phrase, years ago, the Trebich Triangle, and it gets said with a smile, at the pub, late at night, when a man wants to seem interesting. The disappearances are real. I want to be very clear on that point before we go any further. They are documented, they are in the records. But no one seems to take them seriously anymore, and I have come to understand why. The reason is time. The strange ones, the ones that cannot be explained, happen so far apart from one another that no living person ever holds two of them in the same season of fear. Decades pass between them. A whole generation lives and dies in the space between one impossible vanishing and the next. By the time the second happens, the first has faded into the yellowed pages of a regional newspaper, and the people who remember it are old, and the young ones simply shrug their shoulders in that particular Slovak way that I have come to hate a little. And they say, "Oh well, these things happen. At least it was not me. At least it was not me." I have heard those 5 words spoken over the memory of the vanished more times than I can bear, and I have come to believe that they are the most dangerous words in my language because they are the sound a whole nation makes while it looks away. I made a list. Over the years, quietly, on my own time, I gathered the cases together, the ones that do not fit, and I set them side by side. And I looked at them the way you are supposed to look at the center of a thing. I would like to share 3 of them with you tonight, and I would like to know what you think, because I have reached the very end of what a rational man can do with them alone, and I am beginning to be afraid. Before we walk any deeper into these woods together, I want to thank you for being here, in the quiet, wherever you are. If a story like this one keeps you awake in the best possible way, then I would ask you to consider subscribing to Sir Bellico, and to Mr. Bellico, and to Mr. Geronimo, so that not a single account of mine is ever lost to you, the way so much else in this tale has been lost. And if you would do me one small kindness that costs you nothing, leave a comment on this first video and press the like button, because I have come to learn that those 2 simple actions are the only thing that tells the platform to carry a story further, out past my small and quiet country, to every corner of the world where someone is sitting in the shadow of their own gentle mountains, wondering. You will also find my backup channels waiting for you in the collaboration section below, and I would be grateful if you would follow those as well, so that you and I never lose one another, no matter what happens. And if the mood takes you, tell me in the comments the name of your town and the hour it is where you sit right now, so that I know exactly where in the world this story has traveled tonight, and how far the quiet reaches. I will tell you now about the winter of 1929, and about a man who went for a walk. But first I have to tell you about the shape of the fear, because it has a shape, and the shape matters. I have been a ranger in the Trebich for the better part of my working life. I know its trails the way I know the veins on the back of my own hand. I know which hollows hold the cold long into spring and which ridges catch the last of the evening light. I know the sound of every ordinary thing, the drum of a woodpecker, the cough of a roe deer, the particular hiss of wind moving through beech leaves as opposed to pine. And because I know all of the ordinary sounds so well, I have learned to notice very quickly when a sound arrives that is not ordinary. That, in the end, is the whole of my expertise, not bravery, not strength, only a very long familiarity with the way things are supposed to be, which makes me a kind of instrument for detecting the way things are not. There is a place in the Trebech, near the old ruin, where I do not go anymore if I can help it, and where I will not go at all after the light begins to fail. I am not going to pretend to you that I have a good reason. I am telling you plainly that I am a grown man who carries a rifle for a living and who has been trained to be calm, and that there is a hollow of beech trees perhaps 2 hours from the nearest road where the quiet is wrong, and where the ordinary sounds thin out and vanish the closer you come, until you are standing in a green cathedral of total silence in the middle of the afternoon, with the sunlight coming down in slow gold columns, and every animal instinct in your body screaming at you that you are not alone and that whatever is with you is patient and is very, very old. I have felt it watching me. I will say that once, here, and then I will try not to say it again, because when a rational man writes that sentence down he can feel how it looks on the page. I have felt it watching me. Not the prickle of nerves that any person feels alone in the woods, something with weight to it, something with attention. The specific and unmistakable sensation of being considered, the way you are considered by a thing that is deciding whether it is hungry. The first time it happened, years ago, I did what I was trained to do. I stopped. I made myself breathe slowly. I turned in a full circle with my back straight and my eyes moving, cataloging the tree line, looking for the shape that did not belong, the bear, the boar, the lost tourist, anything with a name I could hang the feeling on. There was nothing. There is always nothing. That is the worst part, and it took me years to understand why. When you find the bear, the fear leaves your body, because now the fear has a home. When you find nothing, the fear has nowhere to go, and it stays inside you, and it grows. I walked out of that hollow the first time telling myself a very reasonable story. I told myself that the human mind is a pattern machine that evolved to see predators in the shadows, because the ancestors who saw a leopard in every rustle survived to have children, and the ones who did not were eaten. And so I had simply inherited a nervous system that was tuned by a million years of being prey to feel watched when it was merely alone. That is a true thing about the human mind. I still believe it. I have recited it to myself in that hollow 100 times since, like a prayer. But here is the thing about prayers. You only say them when you are afraid. The old people who live in the villages around the Trebech do not need my reasonable story because they have their own, and theirs is much older than mine, and I have come to suspect in the small hours of the night that theirs is more honest. They do not say the word for the thing out loud. I have asked. I have sat at kitchen tables with grandmothers who were born before the first of my 3 cases, and I have asked them plainly what walks in the Trebech, and every single time the same thing happens. The old woman goes quiet. She looks at the window, even in daylight. And then she says something that is not an answer, something like, "We do not go to the high hollows in the hungry months," or, "The castle was not built to keep the Hungarians out," whatever the books tell you. Or, "My grandmother told me that when the forest goes silent you do not run and you do not call out, you simply turn and walk home at the same speed you came, and you do not look behind you no matter what you hear behind you calling your name. You do not look behind you no matter what you hear behind you calling your name." I want you to hold that instruction in your mind, because we are going to come back to it. It is the oldest piece of wisdom in these mountains, passed down mother to daughter for longer than anyone can count, and I did not understand why it existed until I read the file on the man who went missing in the winter of 1929. And when I finally understood, I wished with everything in me that I had never gone looking. So let me take you back now, almost a century, to a small village in the shadow of the Triangle, and to the first heavy snow of that year, and to a lonely man who told his neighbor that he only wanted some air, all the way back in 1929. A man named Mr. A. Samsali went missing on a snowy day in November. I want you to understand how far away that year truly is. There were no radios in most of the houses. There were no telephones for ordinary men. The roads that reached the villages under the Trebech were dirt tracks that turned to frozen ruts in the winter and to sucking mud in the thaw, and a man who wanted to send word to the next village sent it on foot or he did not send it at all. When Mr. Samsali stepped out of his door that November morning, he stepped into a world that had almost no way of noticing that he was gone. That is part of what the thing in the Trebech has always understood, I think. It has always understood the value of a witness who is far away. The records on Samsali are thin, which is what you would expect for a poor and solitary man in a poor and solitary place nearly 100 years ago. But the shape of the story survived because the villagers kept it, mother to daughter, the way they keep everything that frightens them, and later a regional paper set it down in a few gray paragraphs, and that is how it came to my list. What we know is this: he was not a young man. He lived alone. He had no wife, and he had no children, and in a farming village of that time a man with no family was a man who had, in a certain sense, already half vanished before he ever walked into the trees, because there was no one whose whole world depended on his coming home, no one who would sit up at the window the moment the light failed, no one to raise an alarm until it was already far too late. On that November morning, before the first heavy snow came down, Mr. Samsali spoke to a neighbor. This is the only thing he did that survives. He told the neighbor that he wanted to go for a walk. That was all. He did not say where. He did not say why. He gave no reason. A walk on a raw November morning under a sky already the color of wet ash, when any sensible farmer would be seeing to his animals and banking his fire against the cold that was so plainly coming. He simply said that he wanted to go for a walk, and the neighbor, having no reason on earth to think otherwise, said something ordinary in return, "Good day," or "Mind the weather," or nothing at all, and went back inside to the warmth, and that was the last human word ever exchanged with the man. I have stood at the edge of that village. It still exists, smaller now, half its houses unlit and empty, the young gone to the cities. I have stood on the road at the edge of it in November, when the light goes flat and gray by the middle of the afternoon and the beech woods above the last houses stand black and leafless against the hills, and I have tried to feel my way into the mind of a lonely old man looking up at those trees, and I will tell you honestly that I cannot do it. I cannot construct the thought that would send me up into that forest, alone, with the snow coming. And I have wondered, more than once, standing there in the cold, whether the thought that sent him up was even his own, because that is the pattern. and I did not see it until I had all 3 cases laid out together, and I will not spoil it for you yet. But hold this in your mind. A man who lives alone, with no one to notice, walks up into the Trebich in the worst possible season for no reason that he will name. Hold that. The snow came that afternoon, and it did not stop. The winters were harder then, everyone agrees on that, and the snow of that November came down heavy and wet and then hard and dry on top of it, and it filled the hollows and buried the trails and turned the whole triangle of the Trebich into a single blank white silence, meter upon meter of it, and it did not melt. It stayed all through December and January and February, and so when it became clear some days later that no one had seen Mr. Samsali, that his fire was cold and his door was shut and his animals were starving in their pen, there was nothing to be done. There was no way to search. A man cannot walk into 2 meters of fresh snow on the high ground and look for another man. He would only add himself to the count. The villagers did what little they could along the low ground, and they found nothing, because there was nothing to find on the low ground, and then the weather closed its fist, and everyone understood that the mountain had him now, and that the mountain would not give him back until the spring. I want you to sit with the horror of that particular kind of waiting, because it is a horror we have mostly forgotten in our warm and lighted age. For 4 months, that village lived under the certainty that somewhere above them, under all that snow, in that silence, was the body of a man they had known. 4 months of looking up at the white slopes every gray morning and knowing. And here is the thing that the old accounts mention, and that made the hair stand up on my arms the first time I read it, because it is exactly the kind of detail that no one would invent. They said that all through that winter, the woods above the village were wrong, too quiet, some said, and others said the opposite, that on certain still nights, when the cold had cracked the trees to silence and no wind moved, they heard something up in the tree line. A voice, some of them said, faint and far, and carried down over the snow, calling, and the ones who heard it did exactly what their grandmothers had taught them. They did not go up. They did not call back. They latched their doors and they banked their fires higher, and they did not look at the windows, and in the morning they did not speak of it. And when I came asking a lifetime later, their granddaughters still did not want to speak of it, and told me only in the smallest voice, at the very end, that the old people always said you must never answer the winter woods when they call in the shape of a man, because whatever is calling you already knows your name, and a thing that already knows your name is not a thing that wants to help you. And then, at last, the spring came, and the snow began to draw back up the slopes, and the village went looking for what the mountain had kept. They found nothing. I need you to understand how strange that is, because in the retelling it can slide past you as merely sad. The Trebich is small, I keep saying that, and I keep saying it because it is the whole crux of the thing. This is not the vast and trackless wilderness of some far country where a body could lie undiscovered for 100 years. This is a modest range of gentle hills that a man can cross on foot in a day, threaded through with the trails of shepherds and woodcutters who have worked it since before written memory. When a person dies in the Trebich, ordinarily they are found. They are found by a mushroom picker in the autumn, or by a shepherd moving his flock, or by a woodcutter, or by a forester like me. The mountain gives up its dead because it is a small mountain and it has nowhere to hide them. That is the rule. That is the rule 99 times out of 100, and it is the rule that makes the exceptions so unbearable, because when the Trebich keeps a body, it is not because the body is well hidden, it is because there is no body left to find. Where does a man go? A man does not evaporate. Even if the wolves and the ravens and the slow work of the soil take a body down to nothing in the end, that end takes years, not one winter, and it leaves things behind along the way. It leaves bones, which the animals scatter but do not consume. It leaves the metal buttons of a coat, the nails of a boot, a belt buckle, the small, hard, indigestible facts of a human life, waiting in the leaf litter for someone to stumble on them in 10 years, or 20, or 50. And in the case of Mr. Samsali, over all the decades since, in a range of mountains crawled over by shepherds and hikers and by rangers like me who know every hollow, not one of those small, hard facts has ever surfaced. Not a button, not a nail, nothing. Now, the reasonable people, and I count myself among them on my better days, they have their explanation, and I will give it to you fairly because I promised you I would be honest. They say that Mr. Samsali took his own life. They point to his loneliness, his lack of a wife and children, the raw gray misery of a poor old age in a hard country, and they say that a man like that might well have walked up into the snow on purpose, to lie down in the white and let the cold take him, which is, they will tell you, a quiet and even a merciful death, and that the snow then buried him deep in some hollow the searchers never reached, and that the spring thaw carried him and what was left of him down into some sinkhole or underground stream in the limestone below, of which the Trebech has many, and that this is why nothing was ever found. It is a complete explanation. It uses no ghosts. It closes the file, and on my good days I believe it. I do. I have stood over that closed file, and I have told myself the whole sad, reasonable story of the lonely man and the merciful snow, and I have nodded and I have felt the small relief of a thing explained. But then I remember the voice in the winter woods, the one the whole village heard and no one answered, calling down over the snow in the shape of a man, in the 4 months when everyone already knew that the only man up there was dead. And I remember that a suicide does not call out, and I ask myself who then was doing the calling. And the reasonable story goes very quiet, the way the reasonable story always goes very quiet in the end, and I am left alone with a question that has no floor beneath it. Because here is what I have come to understand about the winter of 1929, and it took me a long time and I did not want to arrive at it. If the old people are right, then the calling was not the man. The calling was the thing that took the shape of the man, testing the doors of the village, learning the names, and finding to its patient satisfaction that no one would come. And it filed that away, the way I file away my cases. It learned that the woods could take a solitary man and that the village would only shrug and wait for spring and find nothing, and in the end close the file and call it a mercy. It learned what it could do and what it could get away with, and it waited. It waited 10 years. And then, in the January snows of 1939, it found a man named Walter Fisher, and with Walter Fisher it did something new, something far worse than a clean vanishing, something that has kept me awake for more nights than I will admit. Because with Walter Fisher, for the first and only time in all my records, the Trebech gave something back. I only wish it had been Walter that came back. Then, in 1939, a man named Walter Fisher went missing, and I have to tell you about him slowly, because everything about Walter Fisher matters, and because the parts of his story that seem ordinary are the parts that frighten me the most. Walter was not a lonely man like Samsali. That is the first thing to understand, and it is the first thing that breaks the reasonable story before we have even begun. Walter had a wife. Walter had children. Walter had every reason on earth to come home. He worked in a shoe factory in a small city on the western side of the Trebech, a city called Partizanske, and in those years that city ran on shoes the way other places ran on coal or steel. Walter worked in that factory 6 days out of every 7, 6 long days on his feet at the machines, and I have known men who did that work. And it grinds a body down and it grinds a spirit down, and the only thing that holds a man together through a week like that is the 7th day and what waits for him on it. And here is what waited for Walter Fisher on the 7th day. His wife and his children did not live with him in the city. They could not afford it. The wages of a shoe factory did not stretch to housing a whole family in Partizanske, and so his wife and his children stayed out in the countryside, in a village. The way so many families were split in those hard years, the man in the town where the work was and the family in the country where the living was cheap, which meant that every Sunday, on his one free day after 6 days of standing at the machines, Walter Fisher would make the journey out to the countryside to see his wife and his children. That was the shape of his life. 6 days of grinding work, and then, on the 7th, the long walk home to the only people who made the 6 days worth surviving. Now, I am a man who has known the particular hunger of a person kept away from the ones they love by work and distance and poverty, and I am telling you that a man who lives that life does not give up his one Sunday with his family lightly. That Sunday was the whole point. That Sunday was the sun that the rest of the gray week rotated around. And so when I read in the old accounts what Walter did on a Sunday in January of 1939, I felt the first cold finger of the thing touch the back of my neck, because it makes no sense, and because the ways in which it makes no sense are exactly the ways in which Simsali made no sense 10 years before. On that Sunday, Walter Fisher decided that he would not go and see his wife and his children. He decided instead that he would go for a hike in the forests of the Trebech. I need you to feel the weight of that choice. Not a hike near home. Not a short walk to clear his head before the long journey to his family. He chose the hike instead of his family, on his one day, in the dead of a Slovak January, when the snows were deep and the days were short and the cold in those mountains could kill a healthy man who lost his way for a single afternoon. No sane, tired, loving father chooses that. And yet Walter chose it. and the only clue we have as to why comes from one of the men he worked beside at the factory, who remembered, afterward when it mattered, that Walter had said something. Walter had mentioned in the days before that he wanted to go and visit a particular place. He wanted to go to the Chirni Hrad. The Chirni Hrad. In my language, the words mean, quite simply, the Black Castle. I know the Chirni Hrad well. It is a ruin now, and it has been a ruin for longer than anyone can say. A broken crown of gray stone standing on a lonely height deep in the folds of the Trebech, its walls half swallowed by the beech woods that have been climbing over it patiently for centuries. The books will tell you that it was a fortress, built many hundreds of years ago in the age of raiders, thrown up on that high ground to guard the country against the Hungarian bands that came up out of the south to burn and to steal. That is what the books say. Tourists come to it, a few of them, in the warm months, and they climb up to the ruin, and they eat their bread and cheese among the fallen stones, and they take their photographs, and they go home. And none of them, I think, ever stand in the exact center of that broken court at the hour when the light begins to slant and feel what I have felt there, which is that the place is not empty, and that it was never really built to keep the Hungarians out. The old people, the grandmothers at the kitchen tables, they have a different story about the Yarmui Hrad, and I did not believe it, and then I could not stop thinking about it. They say the castle was not built against men at all. They say that men only came later and used the walls that were already there, or rebuilt them, or told themselves a soldier's story about raiders and swords, because a soldier's story is a comfortable story, and men prefer an enemy they can see. But the oldest story, the one under the story, is that something was walled up there, or walled out, or that the height itself was a boundary stone, a marker set at the edge of a place you were meant not to cross, at the very heart of the triangle, and that the walls were less a fortress than a warning written in stone for anyone who could still read it. And they say, the old people, that the black in the Black Castle was never a color, that it was a name for what lived above it. I do not know if any of that is true. I am a rational man, and none of it can be proven, and I have stood in that ruin on a bright June day and felt nothing worse than the ordinary melancholy of old stone. But I have also stood there in October, alone, as the afternoon went thin, and I have felt the sound drain out of the woods around me exactly as it drains out of that other hollow I told you about, until I was standing in a ringing silence among the fallen walls with the certain knowledge that I was being watched by something that had watched a great many men climb up to those stones over a great many centuries, and had been patient with all of them, and would be patient with me, right up until the moment it decided not to be. And it was to that place, the Chirni Hrad, the Black Castle, that Walter Fisher set out to walk, alone on a Sunday in January of 1939, instead of going home to his wife and his children. There is one more thing about the geography, and it is the thing that turns the whole matter from strange to impossible, so let me be precise. The Chirni Hrad is 25 kilometers from Partizanske, from the city where Walter lived and worked, 25 kilometers there, through deep snow, through the folds of the winter forest, and then 25 kilometers back, if he intended to return to his lodgings in time to stand at his machines when the factory whistle blew on Monday morning, which he surely did, because a man in those years who missed his shift did not have a shift to come back to. 50 kilometers, on foot, in a single short January day, through snow, over hills, to visit a broken ruin and come straight back. I have walked those mountains my whole life, and I am fit and I am equipped, and I would not attempt 50 kilometers of the winter Trebech in a day, and I do not believe that Walter Fisher, a tired factory worker in the boots and coat of a poor man in 1939, believed he could do it either. Which means, and I want to say this plainly, that a hike was never the real reason. You do not walk 50 kilometers through the snow to a ruin for the pleasure of the walk. That is not a way to relax. That is not what a hard-working, family-loving man does with his one precious day of rest. It sounds, when you lay it all out, like the man had business at the Black Castle. It sounds like he had arranged to meet someone there, or to do something there, something that mattered enough to give up his family and risk his life in the January cold, something that pulled him off the ordinary track of his life the way some Solly was pulled off his, 10 years before, up into the same triangle of trees. And that is the question that has never been answered and that I do not think ever can be. What business could a poor shoe factory worker possibly have had, in the depth of winter, at a ruined castle 25 kilometers from anywhere, that was worth more to him than the faces of his own children? Who, or what, had made the appointment? Because I keep coming back, in the small hours, to that word the old people use, that the castle was a place where a thing was walled out, at the edge of a boundary, at the heart of the triangle. And I keep coming back to the winter of 1929, to the voice in the snow that called down over the village in the shape of a man, learning the names, learning what it could do. And a terrible thought has grown in me over the years, and I am going to set it down here even though I have no proof of it, and even though a rational man should be ashamed of it, because I think that if you have followed me this far, you deserve to know where my mind has gone. I do not think Walter Fisher decided to visit the Black Castle. I think Walter Fisher was called to it. I think the same thing that tested the doors of Samsali's village and learned that it could take a solitary man and go unpunished had spent 10 patient years learning to do more than take. I think it had learned to reach out, somehow, down through the snow and the trees and the miles, into the mind of a tired man in a lighted city, and to plant a thought there that felt like the man's own thought, an appointment, an errand, a reason, and to draw him up out of his ordinary life and off the safe track and into the folds of the triangle, the way a fisherman draws in a line, patiently, hand over hand, so gently that the fish believes right up until the end that it is swimming of its own free will toward something it wants. And on that January Sunday, Walter Fisher walked up into the Trebbetch toward the Black Castle, of his own free will, so far as anyone could ever tell. And then, like Samsali before him, he was gone. But here, at last, the pattern breaks, and I have to tell you what the Trebbetch did next, because it did something it had never done and has never done since. It did not keep Walter Fisher. After the snows and the months and the long silence, after his wife had reported him missing and the whole matter had settled into the gray certainty of another Trebbetch vanishing, the mountains opened their hand. And in the May of 1939, on the far side of the triangle, 30 kilometers away, a man was found lying in a field. And when they turned him over and saw the ruin of what had been Walter Fisher, they must have wished, as I have wished on his behalf ever since, that the mountain had simply kept him, the way it kept the others, and given nothing back at all. His wife reported him missing, of course, and Walter Fisher remained a missing person for months and months. The winter ground on, and the snows lay deep over the triangle, and somewhere out in Europe the great machine of the coming war was turning over and beginning to catch, though no one in that village knew yet how completely it would swallow them. And through all of it, Walter was simply gone. His wife waited, his children waited. 6 days of the week the factory whistle blew in Partizanske, and Walter Fisher was not there to answer it, and on the 7th day the road to the countryside lay empty of him, and the long dread settled over that family the way it settles over every family the Trebbetch touches, the dread of not knowing, which is worse than any grief because grief at least has a shape and an ending and the not knowing has neither. And then, in the May of that same year, 1939, Walter Fisher suddenly showed up alive. I have to be careful with my words here because the phrase "showed up alive" can slide past you as good news, and it was not good news. It was one of the most frightening things in all my records, and the reasons are in the details, so let me give you the details exactly. He was found in the middle of a field, not near the Black Castle, where he had been going, not near Partizanske, where he had come from. He was found more than 30 kilometers away from the place he was last seen, on the complete opposite side of the whole Trebbetch range. Think about what that means with a map in your mind. He went in from the west, aiming for the ruin at the heart of the triangle, and 4 months later he came out in the east, on the far shore of those mountains, 30 kilometers as the raven flies from where he started, on the wrong side of everything. Whatever had happened to Walter Fisher in those lost months, it had carried him, somehow, all the way across the triangle and set him down on the other side, in an open field, alone, in the spring grass, like something discarded when it was finished with. He was unconscious when they found him. He was not walking out under his own power, not staggering toward help, not calling for aid. He was simply lying in the field, senseless, as though he had been dropped there from a great height or set down very gently by something that no longer had any use for him. His clothes were in rags. Whatever he had walked into the Trebbetch wearing that January morning, the good stout coat and boots of a man setting out on a long winter walk, was gone, torn to filthy tatters, hanging off him in strips. 4 months is a long time for clothing to survive hard use, but the accounts do not describe the honest wear of a man living rough in the woods. They describe rags, ruin, a thing gone to pieces on his back, and he was wounded. He was, by every account that survives, horribly wounded, and here is where the story splits in a way that has always troubled me, because the accounts do not agree on the nature of the wounds and both versions are terrible in their own way. Some who saw him, or who heard from those who saw him, said the wounds were burns. Others said they were cuts, burns or cuts. I have turned that over 1,000 times. A man does not easily confuse a burn for a cut, and yet the memories that came down to us cannot settle it, and I have come to wonder whether the truth is that his wounds were something that the people who saw them had no word for, something that looked like a burn from one angle and a cut from another, some marking on the body that the human mind, reaching for the nearest familiar shape, filed sometimes as one thing and sometimes as the other. The way the villagers of 1929 filed a voice in the snow as a lost man because a lost man was the nearest thing they had a word for. When the truth has no name, people reach for the nearest lie, and they do not all reach for the same one. They took him to a hospital, and he stayed there a long time, and slowly the ruined shell of him came back toward the living, at least in the body, and when at last he could speak, and they asked him the only question that mattered, "Where have you been, Walter? What happened to you? What happened in those 4 months?" He told them the truth, or the only truth he had, and it was this: he did not remember. He had no memory of the time that he was missing. None. 4 months of his life, from the January snow to the May grass, from the western edge of the triangle to the eastern, simply were not in him. There was the walk into the woods, and then there was the hospital bed, and between those two things there was nothing at all. A smooth and total blank where 4 months of a human life should have been wiped clean, taken as surely as the others had been taken, except that in Walter's case the mountain had returned the body and kept only the 4 months and the man who used to live inside it. Because the man did not come back. That is the part one need you to understand. The body of Walter Fisher was returned to his family and to the world, but Walter Fisher, the tired, loving father who walked out into the snow, did not return with it. What came back was hollow. Traumatized beyond any reaching, marked in his flesh with wounds that no one could name, and haunted in his mind by 4 months he could not remember and could not forget the absence of, he was never again the man he had been. He never went back to the factory. He never resumed the long Sunday walks to his children. He was taken in the end to a hospital for people with troubles of the mind, and he spent the entire rest of his life there, inside those walls, inside himself, in a silence that no one could enter. Whatever the Trebich gave back was a man-shaped hole where a man used to be. The mountain took Simsali whole and cleanly. With Walter Fisher it did something crueler. It took the man and left the shape, and made his family live beside the shape for the rest of their lives, and call it their husband and their father, and know that it was not. So I will ask you the question that I cannot stop asking myself, and that no one in nearly 100 years has been able to answer. In the name of God, what happened to that man in the 4 months he was gone? If you have stayed with me all the way to this bleakest turn of the road, and if your own skin has gone cold even once along the way, then I would be quietly grateful if you would leave a comment and press the like button before we go on, because those two small things are the only lantern I have to carry this account out to the people who need to find it, out past the borders of my small country to wherever you are sitting in the hush of your own evening. And if you have not yet followed Sir Bellicho, and Mr. Bellicho, and Mr. Geronimo, this would be a good moment to do it, so that we finish this walk together and begin the next one without ever losing the trail between us. The backup channels wait for you in the collaboration section, and I hope you will follow those as well, because in a story like this one, a person can never have too many ways home. Now, there are many theories about what happened to Walter Fisher, and I promised you honesty, so I will give you the reasonable ones, and I will tell you why they do not hold, and then I will tell you why the unreasonable ones frighten me more than I want to admit. Most of the serious theories fasten onto the year 1939 and the great shadow that was falling across all of Europe that spring. The war was coming. Tensions were everywhere, and borders were nervous, and the air was thick with the fear of spies and traitors and enemies within. And so the reasonable people say that Walter Fisher, a man who vanished for 4 months in a border country in the run-up to a war and came back wounded and unable to speak of it, was caught up somehow in all of that he was taken by someone, some authority or some faction, and accused of being a spy, and held, and questioned, and hurt. And this theory has one thing going for it that I have to respect, because it is the only theory that explains the single strangest fact of the whole case, which is that he was wounded but not killed. If some enemy had simply meant to be rid of him, he would be dead and gone like some Solly. But he was hurt and then kept alive, hurt again and kept alive again for months, which means that whatever had him was both harming him and feeding him, keeping the body going for some purpose while it did whatever it did to him. A prisoner is hurt but fed. A prisoner is kept alive on purpose. And so the spy theory, alone among the reasonable answers, accounts for that unbearable detail. And on my good days I let it close the file because it uses no monsters and it lets me sleep. But it does not truly hold, and I know it does not, for reasons I cannot argue away. It does not explain the geography, the 30 kilometers across the whole range, the wrong side of the mountains, the open field. It does not explain why a poor shoe factory worker, with a wife and children in the countryside, would be taken for a spy at all, or by whom, or why they would then simply set him down unconscious in a meadow, rather than dispose of him or return him openly. And most of all, it does not explain the erasure, the total and seamless removal of 4 months from a living mind, which is not a thing that fear and captivity do to a man. Fear and captivity leave a man with memories he would give anything to lose. They do not leave him with a smooth white nothing. The spy theory explains the wounds and abandons everything else, and a theory that saves only the part you can bear to look at is not an explanation. It is a place to hide. And then there are the other theories, the ones the rational people will not touch, and I will name them so that you know I have not hidden them from you. Time. People speak of time portals, of Walter falling out of the ordinary flow of hours and coming back changed. People speak of other dimensions, of doors in the deep woods that open onto places that are not places. People speak of things from beyond the sky, of lights over the Trebech, of the marks on his body as the marks of an examination by something that was studying him the way I study a wounded animal before I decide what can be done for it. These are not things that I believe. I want to say that clearly one more time, because I am a rational man and I have a rational man's contempt for easy wonders, and I will not stand here and tell you that a man was taken by aliens, because I do not believe he was. But I will tell you this, and then I will let the chapter end. Every one of those wild theories, the time and the dimensions and the lights, was invented by people reaching, exactly like the villagers reaching for a lost man in the snow, exactly like the witnesses reaching for a burn or a cut, reaching for the nearest shape they had, to cover a thing that has no shape and no name and that the human mind cannot hold. The theories are all wrong, but the reason there are so many of them, the reason people have reached so far and so wildly for 100 years, is that they are all trying to cover the same hole, and the hole is real, and the hole is the exact shape of the 4 months that came out of the middle of Walter Fisher, and I do not know what fills it, and I am afraid that the old people at the kitchen tables have always known, and have always been too wise to say. The next case is the one that lives closest to me, and I will tell you why before I tell you the story. It is the most recent of the 3, and it is the best documented, and it is the one whose ground I have walked with my own boots more times than any other, because it happened in a part of the Trebech that falls within the country I patrol. When I say that the thing in these mountains is real to me, it is Jan and Elena that I mean. The other 2 are old paper and old snow. Jan and Elena are a place I can drive to. It happened in February of 1966. By then, of course, the world had changed almost beyond recognition from the world of Samsali and Walter Fisher. The war had come and gone and scarred everything and receded. There were cars now, ordinary people had cars, and there were paved roads reaching in toward the mountains, and telephones, and newspapers with wide reach, and the machinery of a modern state that could organize a search and print a photograph and mobilize a whole country to look for 2 of its citizens. If the Trebech had ever been going to be caught in the act, if the thing in the triangle had ever been going to make a mistake and be seen, it should have been in 1966, in the full light of the modern age with all its cars and cameras and telephones. And so what makes this case the most frightening of all, to me, is that the modern age changed nothing. All our machinery and all our light made no difference whatsoever. The mountain did exactly what it had always done, in full view of everyone, and we were no more able to stop it or explain it than the villagers had been in the snow of 1929. We had only made better records of our helplessness. Jan and Elena were husband and wife. That is the second thing that matters, and it matters enormously because it breaks the pattern that I had been building in my own mind and shows me that the pattern is deeper and worse than I understood. Samsali was a solitary man with no one to notice. Walter was a man alone, drawn away from his family and off the safe track by some errand of his own. I had begun, God forgive me, to comfort myself with the idea that the thing took the isolated, the singular, the ones who wandered off alone, and that there was therefore a kind of safety in numbers, in company, in not being alone in the deep woods. Jan and Elena took that comfort from me and left nothing in its place, because Jan and Elena were not alone. They were together. They were 2. And they were a married pair who by every account loved each other and trusted each other, and they walked into the Trebech side by side, in each other's company, in the middle of a clear day, and the mountain took them both. Here is everything we know, and I have read the files more times than I can count. In February of 1966, Jan and Elena drove out to the city of Vilenik, which sits at the edge of the Trebech, on the frontier between the tame country and the wild. They parked their car near the forest. And then, apparently, they went off hiking together, up into the trees, the way thousands of ordinary couples have done thousands of ordinary times, before and since, and come home for their supper. That is all. That is the whole of it. They parked, and they walked into the woods, and they were never seen again by any living person as long as the world has turned. Now I want to draw your attention to the ordinariness, because in this case the investigators did draw their attention to it, and found, to their frustration and eventually to their fear, that there was nothing wrong with it anywhere. This is what separates 1966 from the older cases and makes it so much harder to wave away. There was nothing strange about Jan and Elena. The car was found later, parked where they had left it, and the car was fine, not damaged, not disturbed, not run off the road or broken into or abandoned in a panic. It sat exactly where two people would leave it who intended to walk into the woods for a few hours and then drive home. Their friends and their family were questioned closely, and no one, not one person, had noticed anything odd in the way that Jan and Elena had been acting in the days before. No trouble between them. No debts, no threats, no strange visitors, no talk of running away, none of the small human wreckage that lies at the bottom of the ordinary explanations when two people vanish. There was nothing. They were a normal, happy, unremarkable couple, and on an unremarkable February day they parked a car that was in perfect order and walked, calm and content and together, into the forest, and the forest closed over them like water over a stone. The case got far more attention than the older ones, as you would expect in the modern age. The newspapers took it up. I have read that the whole of Slovakia searched for that couple, far and wide, and I believe it, because I have seen the scale of it in the records. Search parties combed the Trebech. They went over the ground where a small range of gentle hills can be gone over, thoroughly, by hundreds of people, for days. And they found nothing. No trace of Jan, no trace of Elena, no clothing, no belongings, no sign of a struggle, no sign of an accident. No sign of two human beings having passed that way at all, beyond the empty car at the tree line. And there is one line in the record of that search that I have never been able to shake, spoken by one of the policemen who worked the case, a practical man doing a practical job, and it is the most honest thing any official has ever said about the Trebech, and it frightens me more than any grandmother's tale. He said that it was as though they had simply stepped out of their car, walked into the woods, and completely disappeared. Stepped out of the car, walked into the woods, and disappeared. Not lost, not fallen, not taken by wolves, which would leave a sign, which always leaves a sign. Disappeared, in the middle of a searched and searchable forest, in the modern age, in full daylight, together, as if they had walked between two trees and out of the world entirely. Now, I am going to tell you something that is not in any file, and that I have told to very few people, because I am a ranger and my calm is my profession, and a man in my position does not say these things lightly. But I have promised you honesty from the beginning, and I owe you this because it is the reason I am no longer able to close these files and sleep. I have walked the ground where Jan and Elena parked their car. I have walked up from that tree line into the woods above Vilenek, following as best I can the way that two people would most naturally have gone, on patrols, in every season for years, because a part of me has never been able to stop looking for them, even though I know that they have been gone longer than I have been alive. And on one afternoon, some years ago now, in the autumn, alone on that exact ground, I had the worst hour of my life, and I have never gone back to that particular fold of the forest since, and I never will. It began the way I have told you the Trebech always begins, with the silence. I had climbed perhaps an hour up from where the car had been, into a stand of old beach where the ground levels into a shallow bowl, and I became aware, the way you become aware of a change in the weather, that the ordinary sounds of the forest had thinned and then stopped. No birds, no wind in the leaves, though I could see the high branches moving. No small rustlings in the leaf litter, only that ringing, held breath silence that I have learned means I am no longer merely alone. I stopped. I did what I was trained to do. I made myself breathe, and I stood there in the gold October light coming down through the bare and half-bare branches, in a silence so complete that I could hear the blood moving in my own ears, and I felt it. The weight, the attention, the specific and unmistakable sensation of being considered by something patient and old and close. And then, from the trees ahead of me, from the direction I had been walking, I heard my name. I want to be very precise, because precision is the only thing that keeps me steady when I remember it. It was not a trick of the wind. I have spent my life listening to the wind in these woods, and I know every voice it has, and this was not one of them. It was a human voice, and it spoke my name, my own name, clearly and quietly from somewhere in the beaches ahead, at a distance of perhaps 40 or 50 meters, in a tone that was warm and familiar and glad, the tone of someone who has been waiting for you and has just caught sight of you coming. It said my name the way a friend says it, the way a wife might say the name of a husband she loves when he comes home. And there was no one there. There was no one within kilometers of me that I knew of. There was no one who could have known I was on that ground in that hour alone. And every drop of the old wisdom that I had gathered from the grandmothers at the kitchen tables rose up in me all at once and became in a single instant not folklore but instruction, not a story but a rule for staying alive. You do not answer the winter woods when they call in the shape of a man. When the forest goes silent, you do not run and you do not call out. You simply turn and walk home at the same speed you came, and you do not look behind you no matter what you hear behind you calling your name. So I did not answer. God help me, everything in my body wanted to answer, wanted to call out who is there, wanted to walk toward that warm and familiar voice that knew me and was glad to see me. And I understood in that moment, with a clarity that has never left me, exactly how Simsali went up into the snow, and exactly how Walter kept his terrible appointment, and exactly how Jan and Elena walked calm and content into the trees, because the pull of it was enormous. The pull of that voice was like a hand closing around my heart, and it took everything I had not to go toward it. But I did not go toward it. I turned my back on the voice, and on the silence, and on the shallow bowl of beaches, and I began to walk down the way I had come, at the same steady pace, not faster, because the old rule says the same speed, and I understood suddenly why, because a thing that hunts is roused by fleeing, and I made myself walk as though I were only strolling home, with my back straight and my breath slow, and my whole soul screaming. And it called me again, behind me now. Closer, I thought, though I will never be certain because I did not look. It called my name again, and this time there was something else under the warmth, something that was learning the warmth, trying it on, the way you might hear a voice that has almost mastered a language but has one word slightly wrong, and I did not look. And it called a third time, and I did not look. And I walked down out of that fold of the Trebich at the same steady pace with the voice of my own name following me down through the trees. And I did not look behind me, not once, not even at the tree line, not even when I reached the open ground where the sky came back and the ordinary sounds of the world returned all at once like water rushing back into a place it had been held out of. And I got into my vehicle and I sat there with my hands shaking on the wheel. And only then, in the safe metal box of the modern age, did I finally understand what the old people had always known, and why they never say the name. I do not know whose voice it was wearing. I try not to think about it. But I have wondered, on the nights when I cannot help it, whether the thing in the Trebich, having taken Jan and Elena on that February day in 1966, kept something of them the way it kept the 4 months of Walter Fisher, and whether what was glad to see me in the beaches that October afternoon, what said my name so warmly from the silent trees, had learned to say it in a voice it had been practicing since before I was born. Anyone who knows these particular cases finds them completely baffling, and I want to explain, now that you have walked through all three of them with me, exactly why they baffle a rational person. Because the reason is precise, and the precision is the whole horror. Like I have said again and again, and I say it once more because it is the key to everything. The Trebich is small. People go missing there, yes. But because it is so small, they are found about 99 times out of 100. That is the truth, and it is the truth I hold on to, and it is the truth that ought to comfort me and instead does the opposite. A hiker turns an ankle in a hollow and cannot walk out, and we find him. A tourist wanders off the marked trail and gets himself lost, and we find him, cold and embarrassed, usually within a day. An old man has a weak heart give out on a summer climb, and we find his body, and it is sad, and it is ordinary, and it has a name and a cause and an ending. 99 times out of 100, the Trebich gives back what it takes, quickly and completely, because it is a small mountain with nowhere to hide anything, and every one of those 99 cases has a totally normal explanation, and I have signed off on more of them than I can count, and slept soundly afterward. But then there is the one. There is the 1 in 100. There is Simsali, who walked up into the snow and left not a button behind in a range crawled over by shepherds for a century. There is Walter Fisher, who kept an appointment no one arranged at a castle no one should visit, and came back on the wrong side of the mountains with 4 months carved out of him and wounds no one could name. There is John and Elena, who stepped out of a perfectly good car in the full light of the modern age and walked into a searchable forest and out of the world, together, leaving a policeman to say the only honest thing anyone has ever said, that it was as though they simply disappeared. And to have those cases, the clean and total vanishings, the man who came back hollow, set against all the ordinary found ones, is enough to make even the most rational man, even a man like me who has spent his life explaining the woods to frightened tourists, lie awake and wonder what is reality and what is the kind of story we tell ourselves, because the truth cannot be lived beside. Because here is the pattern, at last, the one I have been circling from the very beginning, the one I was too afraid to say plainly until you had seen all the pieces. It is not random. That is the thing. If the Trebich simply killed people now and then, that would be nature, and nature is terrible, but nature is not personal. But the 1 in 100 is not nature. The 1 in 100 is chosen. Look at them together. A solitary man with no one to notice, in 1929, tested, taken, and no one came, and it learned. A family man drawn off the safe track by a summons planted in his mind, in 1939, taken, studied, hollowed, and returned as a warning or a leaving or a thing simply finished with, and it learned more. And a loving pair walking together in trust and daylight in 1966, taken both at once, to teach me and anyone else foolish enough to look that there is no safety in numbers and no safety in daylight and no safety in love. Each one is different. Each one is a step. Each one is a patient creature learning what it can do and what it can get away with, across decades, across a century, with all the time in the world, because whatever it is not in a hurry, and a thing that is not in a hurry is the most frightening thing there is. And I did something in my searching that I want to tell you about, because it is the reason I am no longer able to believe that this is only a Slovak story, or only a Trebich story, or only my own. I began to look further out. I am a rational man. And rational men look for patterns, and I could not shake the feeling that a thing this old and this patient could not possibly be confined to one small triangle of hills in one small country in the middle of Europe. So I read everything I could find in every language I could manage, about places in the world where people vanish the way they vanish in the Trebich, cleanly, completely, against all reason, in country that should give them back. And I found them. God help me, I found them. And the largest and most terrible of them are on the far side of the world, in the great forests of North America. There are places over there, vast wildernesses, national parks, and deep woods that go on for a size my small country cannot even imagine, and in those places people vanish by the hundreds, and are never found, in exactly the ways that turned my hair gray here. Experienced people, careful people. Children who let go of a parent's hand for one moment on a wide trail in bright sun and were simply gone, no body, no trace, searched for by hundreds and found by none. Grown men who stepped behind a tree and out of the world, and the pattern of it, when I read the accounts, was so exactly the pattern of the Trebich that I had to put the book down and sit very still for a long time, because the impossible geography was there. The people found on the wrong side of a mountain range they could not have crossed, and the erased time was there. The rare returned ones who could not say where they had been, and the wounds were there, and the silence in the woods was there. That same falling away of all the ordinary sound just before, that same thinning of the world. And here is what struck me hardest of all, and here is why I now believe what the grandmothers believe. The first peoples of that far continent who lived in those forests for longer than we have written words, and the settlers who came after them and learned the hard way, they had a name for what did it. They had many names in many tongues for the thing that lives in the deep woods and hungers and never stops hungering, the thing that wears the shape of what it eats, the thing that calls to you in the voice of someone you love in order to draw you off the trail and into the trees. I am not going to try to speak the oldest of those names aloud, because there are things you do not say into the quiet, and because I do not have the right, but you know the kind of story I mean. A hunger with no bottom, a hollowing, a thing that takes a man and leaves the shape and calls the next one down in the voice of the last. And when I read those old stories from the other side of the world, I was not reading about America at all. I was reading about the shallow bowl of beaches above Jelinek, and the voice that said my name so warmly, and Walter Fisher's 4 months, and the calling in the snow of 1929. I was reading about my own mountains in a language that had a name for what I do not. That is what I have come to believe, and I know how it sounds, and I am telling you anyway. I do not think the Trebich has a curse. I think the Trebich has a resident, I think the same kind of ancient, patient, hollowing hunger that the old peoples of the American forests knew and named and feared and taught their children to walk carefully around, lives also in the heart of my small triangle of hills, under the black castle that was built to wall it out or wall it in, and that it has lived there for longer than the castle, longer than the name, longer than the country, and that it takes what it wants, when it wants, slowly, 1 in 100, and that all our modern light and all our machinery have never touched it and never will, because you cannot search for a thing that is not hiding, and you cannot explain a thing that has no name, and you cannot save yourself from a thing by refusing to believe in it. The believing or the not believing makes no difference to it at all. It was here before we had the words to deny it, and it will be here after. And this is the thing that frustrates me almost past bearing, and it is the reason I am doing this, the reason I have written all of this down and sent it out into the world in a language not my own. Almost no one outside of Slovakia has ever heard of the Trebech missing people, and the few who have heard of them assume that they are only campfire stories, only folklore, only the kind of thing a small country tells about a small mountain, and I understand why they assume that, because my own people give them every reason to. My own people shrug. My own people say, oh well, at least it was not me, and look away and let the files close and let 100 years pass between one horror and the next so that no one ever has to hold 2 of them at once and be forced to see. The shrug is how a nation survives living next to a thing it cannot fight. But the shrug is also how the thing survives us. The shrug is the silence the villagers kept in the winter of 1929, grown to the size of a whole people. And I have come to believe that the silence is the thing's oldest ally, older even than the hunger, because a thing that no one will look at directly can go on doing what it does forever. So I am not shrugging. That is the whole of my purpose. I am a rational man, and I still believe, on my good days, that there must be some normal explanation for all of this, some answer I am simply not clever enough to see, sinkholes and predators and the run-up to a war and the ordinary sad mathematics of a place where people sometimes go missing. I hold on to that. But I cannot see the explanation, and I have looked longer and harder than anyone, and that is exactly why I am trying to get this story to as many people in the English-speaking world as I can, to as much light as I can find, because the one thing the thing in the Trebech has never had to face, in all its long and patient centuries, is a great many people, from a great many places, all looking at it directly at the same time, and refusing to shrug, and refusing to look away. Maybe if enough light is shed on it, from far enough away, by enough people who owe it no silence, the mystery will finally be solved. Maybe someone out there, listening tonight, knows something I do not. Maybe together we can do the one thing my own people have never been willing to do, which is to keep looking at the center of it, and not turn our backs, and not answer when it calls. That is why I need you. Not in a small way, in the way the whole matter needs you. If this account has unsettled you, if the voice in the beaches has followed you a little way home tonight, then please do the small things that keep this fire burning where the thing in the mountains cannot reach to put it out. Subscribe to Sir Belicho, and to Mr. Belicho, and to Mr. Geronimo, so that not one of these stories is ever lost to the silence the way Samsali was lost, the way John and Elena were lost. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and press the like button, because I promise you those 2 small motions of your hand are the only thing that carries this out past my borders to the far forests where someone may finally have the piece I am missing. And go to the collaboration section and follow the backup channels waiting for you there, every one of them, so that no matter what happens, no matter which account falls silent, you and I can always find our way back to one another in the gloom and keep looking together, and never leave each other alone in the trees, because that, in the end, is the only wisdom the old people ever really gave me, under all the tales and all the warnings. Do not go up into the high hollows in the hungry months. Do not run and do not call out when the forest goes silent. And whatever you do, whatever you hear behind you in the beaches calling your own name in the voice of someone who loves you, someone who has been waiting a very long time for you to come, do not answer it, and do not go toward it, and do not ever look behind you. Walk home at the same speed you came. I am still walking, and I am not looking back. And I am so very glad that for a little while tonight, in the quiet, wherever you are, I did not have to walk alone. This is Redeem. Mind the weather, and mind the silence most of all. The radio crackled to life at 8:30 on a morning that felt no different from any other. It was early October in Alaska, and the light was already slanting through the office windows at an angle that made you think about seasons changing, about the way the sun had owned the sky just weeks before and how it would abandon us soon enough. I was sitting at my desk with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, processing some routine incident reports from the previous week when dispatch came through. There was illegal dumping on one of the local trails. I have worked in the Park Service for years now, and in that time I have responded to countless calls of this nature. Illegal dumping is something that happens with regularity in areas where the forest opens up to access roads and where people think that nobody is watching. They load up their trucks with construction debris, old appliances, anything they do not want to pay the disposal fee for, and they drive to the end of some remote road and just throw it out. The forest becomes their landfill. The trail becomes their dumping ground. This particular call had come in from a jogger who had been running one of the more popular routes through our section of the park. They had seen what looked like discarded materials just off the trail, roughly a quarter-mile in from the parking area. It was a straightforward call, and I knew immediately that I would need to go out and assess the situation. These things always required verification before we could determine whether we were looking at a minor littering incident or something more involved. Sometimes I knew people called in the smallest things, a few pieces of discarded wood, some old shingles, but we had to check them all the same. I finished the coffee anyway, despite the bitterness, and made my way back to where we kept the equipment and gear. My partner that morning was a man I worked with regularly, someone I had known for a good while and someone I trusted to handle the routine nature of what we were about to do. His name does not matter much to this story, really. What matters is that he was there, that we went together, and that what we found in the woods that day was not what we expected to find. We collected our packs and our marking materials. We checked the maps and confirmed the general area where the jogger had reported the dumping. It was on one of the main trails, the kind of place that got decent foot traffic on the weekends and joggers like the one who had called it in on weekday mornings. The trees there grew thick, and the forest had a particular quality about it even in the afternoon light. There was something about that section of the park that I had never quite been able to put into words. Other rangers had mentioned it too. It was beautiful, yes, but it was the kind of beauty that existed alongside something else, a weight, an attentiveness, as if the forest there was aware of you in a way that other sections were not. Subscribe now to Sir Belecho for more true stories like this one, where rangers venture into the deep woods and encounter things that still do not make sense. We set out in the early morning, driving to the trailhead and making sure that our vehicle was locked up properly. The parking area was nearly empty. There was one other vehicle there, a weathered sedan that had probably been parked overnight, belonging to someone who had decided to get an early start on a hike. The air was crisp, the kind of crisp that Alaska air gets when summer is truly done and autumn is moving in with authority. I remember the sound of our boots on the gravel as we walked toward the trail entrance. The forest ahead of us seemed to settle into a particular kind of quiet as we approached. The trail itself was well maintained. Someone, or several someones, had done the work of clearing brush and keeping the wider path open. We moved at a steady pace. There was no need to rush, but there was also an understanding between myself and my partner that we would keep moving. We wanted to verify the dumping situation before the day got too far along. The deeper parts of the trail were not the safest places to be as the sun started its descent. People often ask me, now that years have passed and the whole thing has taken on a different meaning, whether I felt anything wrong that morning, whether there was some instinctual awareness that something was off. The truth is more complicated than a simple yes or no. The truth is that there is always something in the forest. Not something physical necessarily, but something in the quality of the air and the way the light falls and the knowledge that you are in a place where humans are visitors and not owners. That is not a premonition. That is just the forest. We walked for perhaps 20 minutes. The trail curved around stands of evergreen, and we could hear the distant sound of water from a creek that ran parallel to the path. The smell of the forest was overwhelming in that way that Alaska forests can be overwhelming. There is something about the density of growing things and the richness of the soil and the way everything is composting and regenerating at once that creates a scent unlike any other place I have known. It is almost overwhelming, but if you have been in the forests of Alaska long enough, it becomes the smell of home. My partner and I did not talk much as we walked. This was common for us. We had a comfortable silence, the kind that comes from having worked together for long enough that words are not always necessary. He knew how I worked. I knew how he worked. We could move together through the forest without needing to fill the space with conversation. When we got closer to the reported location, we slowed down and started looking more carefully into the woods on both sides of the trail. That was when we saw it. discarded materials, just as the jogger had reported. There was old wood, some construction debris, what looked like old roofing materials. It was scattered but not too far from the trail. Someone had taken the time to bring it out here and leave it. Whether they had done it yesterday or weeks ago, we could not tell at first glance. We started to examine the site more carefully, looking for anything that might indicate who had done the dumping or when. Sometimes there are documents or materials that can help identify the source of the illegal dumping. We were focused on that work when my partner looked up from the pile of materials and looked into the forest. "What in the world?" he said. "There is a guy there." I looked up and followed his gaze. About 20 yards away, just past the tree line where the forest deepened into shadow and thickness, there was a man. He was crouched behind a bush, not standing, but crouched with his body folded over, positioned in a way that suggested he had been that way for some time. He was watching us. I remember the feeling of that moment with absolute clarity, even now, all these years later. It was the feeling of being observed by something that you had not known was watching. It was the feeling of that shift in the forest I had always sensed, the shift from observer to observed. The man was white, with long hair that hung down past his shoulders, and there was something about his posture and his absolute stillness that made it clear he had not been doing whatever he claimed to be doing. He was watching us, and he was crouched and he was waiting. When he realized that we had seen him, something changed. He did not seem startled. He did not jerk upright or try to move away quickly. Instead, he stood up slowly, and as he stood, he stretched his arms up into the air above his head in a long, luxurious movement. He stretched like a man who had just woken up, or like a man who was trying to convey that he had been doing something innocent all along. He stretched like a man who was performing. My partner recognized him immediately. His name was Israel Kias, and he was a local construction contractor. He had actually built a deck for my partner the year before, or so my partner told me as the man started walking toward us. They had had a business relationship. They knew each other in the way that people in small communities know each other, through work and proximity and the shared understanding that in a place like Alaska you end up crossing paths with the same people again and again. The man approached us with a friendly demeanor. He said hello to my partner, and they exchanged pleasantries. They spoke about the deck, about how it was holding up, about the weather and the coming winter. All the normal things that people who know each other say to each other when they encounter one another unexpectedly. The whole time he was talking, I was watching him. I was trying to make sense of what I had seen. He explained that he had just stepped off the path for a moment because he needed to take a leak. That was what he said. That was his explanation for why he had been crouched behind a bush, watching us, waiting for us to notice him. But I had seen him. We had both seen him. He had not been taking a leak. He had been crouched, waiting, watching. I did not say anything about this discrepancy. I did not point out that what we had observed did not match what he was telling us. Instead, I listened as my partner and this man continued their conversation. I performed the role of a park ranger who had just encountered someone in the woods who happened to know his partner. I did everything except speak the truth of what I had seen. There was something about the man that made me want to be very careful. There was something about the way he carried himself and the way his eyes moved and the way he had reacted to being caught watching us that made me understand on some instinctual level that confrontation was not the way to handle this particular moment. He had done something that he was not willing to admit to. He had been where he should not have been, doing something he could not explain. But he was not aggressive, he was friendly, he was performing normalcy so well that it almost worked. My partner asked him if he was aware of the illegal dumping on the trail. The man said that he was not, that he had just been out for a walk to stretch his legs and clear his head. My partner asked if he had seen anything suspicious. The man said that he had not. My partner seemed to accept this explanation, and we made sure that the man was not responsible for the dumping we had found. We checked his vehicle, we asked him questions, we went through the motions of verification. He was cooperative. He was friendly. He was exactly the person that someone who knew him in a professional capacity would expect him to be. And then, after my partner had confirmed that he had nothing to do with the dumping, the man asked if he could walk back with us. He said that he had been out here for a while and that he was heading back to his car anyway. My partner said that he could certainly walk with us, and so the three of us began walking back along the trail together. We walked for a long time. The man maintained a steady conversation with my partner, and I followed behind, listening and watching. We talked about construction and about the local community and about the way the weather was changing, all the normal things. All the things that people talk about when they are trying to establish normalcy and routine in a conversation. The whole time, I was trying to make sense of what I had seen and what I was not saying. Here is the thing that haunts me about that encounter. It was the ordinary nature of it. It was the fact that this man was someone my partner knew, someone who had built things in his home, someone who existed in the normal world and could have normal conversations. He was not a stranger. He was not someone we could easily dismiss. He was a man with a name and a business and a reputation in the community, and he had been crouched in the woods watching us. When we reached the trailhead and parted ways, the man thanked us for the walk and said that he hoped we would have a good rest of the day. My partner said the same in return. I said very little. I remember watching him walk to his vehicle and get in and drive away. I remember thinking that I had just encountered something that I did not have the language for, something that did not fit into the normal categories of right and wrong, dangerous and safe, normal and abnormal. As we got into our own vehicle and headed back, my partner seemed to think nothing of the encounter. He had seen an old acquaintance while out doing our job. It was mildly odd that the man had been in the woods, but he had an explanation, and that was that. But I could not let it go so easily. If you have enjoyed this story so far, I urge you to please like and subscribe to Mr. Appalachia, another one of our channels dedicated to the true stories that park rangers cannot quite explain. That night, I went home and I tried to sleep, but I kept thinking about that moment when the man had stood up and stretched his arms in the air. I kept thinking about the way he had been waiting. I kept thinking about what he might have been waiting for if we had not come around that bend in the trail. I kept thinking about the fact that my partner had introduced him to me by name, that I now knew who he was, and that something about him had triggered every warning instinct I possessed. The autumn wore on, and the incident in the forest began to feel like something that had happened to someone else. This is the way of memory sometimes. The things that terrify you in the moment, the things that make you feel unsettled and unsafe, they begin to fade when you return to the normalcy of your routine. You convince yourself that you were being paranoid. You convince yourself that your interpretation of events was skewed by some combination of being in the forest and the particular state of mind that comes with that. You convince yourself that a man in the woods, even a man who was not doing what he claimed to be doing, was not necessarily a threat. You convince yourself that the man your partner knew, the construction contractor who built decks and knew people in the community, was probably harmless. But some part of me did not believe this. Some part of me remained unsettled. The forest continued as it always did. The work continued as it always did. The seasons shifted from autumn to the early stages of winter, and the work of maintaining the park and responding to incidents continued without interruption. I did my job. I went out on calls and checked on reports and worked with my colleagues to keep the park safe and maintained. I did all the normal things that a park ranger does, but sometimes, when I was walking a trail alone, I would think about that man in the woods. I would think about the moment when he had realized we had seen him. I would think about the stretch he had done, the way his arms had gone up into the air. I would think about the smile on his face, which had seemed genuine, which had seemed friendly, which had seemed like the smile of a man who was not doing anything wrong. There is something about the human face, though, that sometimes betrays intentions that words do not. There is something in the eyes or the set of the mouth or the angle of the shoulders that can tell you a different story than the one a person is speaking. I had seen that something in the face of the man in the woods. I had seen that his smile was not quite aligned with something else. There was a dislocation there. There was a mismatch between what he was saying and something that was happening underneath. Years would pass before I would understand what that dislocation meant. In the meantime, I did my job, and I did not think about the man in the woods every day, but I thought about him often enough that he had become a permanent part of my memory of that season. He had become the man in the woods, the strange encounter that did not quite fit into any category I could understand. Subscribe to Mr. Geronimo, where we share stories that the mainstream media does not want you to hear. Encounters that challenge everything we think we know about the people who live among us. It was perhaps 3 years later when I heard the news. The man who had been crouched in the woods, the man who had built a deck for my partner, the man who had explained that he was just taking a break to take a leak, had been arrested. There was a girl involved. There was a robbery. There was a shot fired, or so I was told initially. There was talk of an altercation at a coffee shop, an incident that had escalated. Violence that had ended with someone dead. The news came through a combination of sources: word of mouth, local news, the kind of information that filters through a community when something significant has happened. The man had been arrested. The man had killed someone. The man was a murderer. It took time for the full story to emerge. That is usually how these things work. The news outlets report what they are told, and then as the investigation continues, more information comes to light. As more information came to light, the story became stranger and stranger. It was not just the one girl. It was not just an altercation at a coffee shop. It was not just a robbery that had gone wrong. The man, Israel Keys, was a serial killer. He had been traveling the country for years. He had been abducting people, taking them to locations where he could torture them and kill them in private. He had been doing this for years, and nobody had caught him because his methods were sophisticated and his choices about whom to target were seemingly random. He did not select victims the way that other killers sometimes do. He did not target a specific type. He did not seem to have a signature beyond the fact that he was methodical and careful and willing to wait for the right moment. The details that emerged were horrific. They were almost too strange to be real. The man had been burying murder kits in various locations across the country. He would bury boxes filled with guns and cash and tools and other things that he would need to commit murder. He would then travel to these locations, sometimes years later, and dig them up and use the contents to commit his crimes. He had hidden these kits in forests and wilderness areas. He had buried them under the soil of the land I was sworn to protect. I remember reading about this in the days and weeks after the arrest. I remember the feeling of understanding beginning to dawn on me about what we had likely encountered in the forest that day. I remember the moment when I realized that the man who had been crouched in the woods, who had been watching us, who had been waiting for something, might have been waiting for a victim. He might have been positioning himself on a trail where people walked, waiting to see if the person who came around the corner was someone he could take. And then we came around the corner instead, and the plan, whatever it was, did not proceed. The details of the crimes were methodical. Keys had victim after victim in different states. He had killed in places that were far from his home. He had killed people who were seemingly unconnected to each other, which made it difficult for law enforcement to understand that they were looking for a serial killer rather than isolated incidents. The case began to expand as investigators looked at unsolved murders across the country and tried to determine which ones might have been committed by Keys. The investigation into his background revealed that he had military connections, he had survival training, he had knowledge of how to operate in wilderness areas. He had the kind of skills that would allow him to stay hidden and to move through landscapes without being detected. He was, in many ways, the perfect predator for the kind of hunting ground that he had selected. He was someone who understood the forest, who understood isolation, who understood the places where people went when they thought they were safe but were actually quite vulnerable. I began to think about that encounter in the woods differently after this information started to emerge. I began to wonder if what we had witnessed was the moment when a predator had realized that his intended prey had been interrupted. I began to wonder if the man had been crouched there for hours, waiting for the right person to come along. I began to wonder if the jogger who had called in the illegal dumping, or the person who would come running on the trail after us, or someone else entirely, had been the target. The more I learned about Keys and his methods, the more I understood that the encounter we had had was not random, it was not coincidence. He was there because the trail was a place where people came. He was there because he had selected this location as a hunting ground. He was there because he was waiting, and we interrupted it. When I think about what might have happened if my partner and I had not come around that corner, if the trail had not been one of the places that we were responsible for checking that morning, if the call about illegal dumping had come in a day later or never come in at all, I find myself unable to complete the thought. There is a version of this story where we do not appear around the corner. There is a version where someone else comes walking down that trail and finds themselves face to face with a man who was crouching in the woods. There is a version where Israel Keys finds the victim he had been waiting for. The story began to fill the local news more and more as the investigation continued. People in the community were shocked. The man was known, he had worked on people's homes, he had lived in the area. He was someone that people had interacted with, that people had trusted, that people had invited into their houses. And he had been a serial killer all along, conducting his murders in secret, burying his tools and his weapons in the forest, traveling back and forth across the country to kill. One of the things that struck me most deeply about the case was the random nature of the victim selection. This was not a man who was targeting a specific type. This was a man who seemed to be hunting simply because hunting was what he did. He would go to a place, and he would wait, and he would see if someone came along who was vulnerable. If they did, he would take them. If they did not, he would move on and try somewhere else. In many ways, this randomness is what makes serial killers like Keys so terrifying. There is no logic to victim selection. There is no pattern that you can identify and avoid. There is only the fact that at some moment you might be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and a person who has decided to hunt will see you as prey. The case against Keyes was building. There was physical evidence. There were the murder kits that had been found. There were confessions. There was the horrific timeline of his crimes spreading out across years and states. There was the understanding that law enforcement had managed to stop a man who had been operating with relative impunity, a man who had developed a system for his murders that was methodical and careful and difficult to track. But there were also questions. There were also the parts of the story that did not fit. There were the locations where he had buried murder kits that did not seem to correspond to any specific crime. There were the murders that he had not confessed to but that investigators suspected him of committing. There were the gaps in the timeline, the places where his movements were not fully accounted for, the victims that might have been his but were never confirmed. I did not know, in those days when the news was breaking, that I had been there. I did not know that I had been present at a moment that might have been critical to understanding Keyes and his methods. I did not know that the encounter we had in the forest was something that should be investigated and understood more fully. I was just a park ranger who had encountered someone in the woods, and later I had learned that the person was a serial killer. The connection between the two facts did not seem immediately obvious to most people, but to me it became obvious over time. Like and comment on our first video to help us grow our channel and reach more people who need to hear these stories. Years passed and the case continued to develop. Keyes was in custody. Keyes was awaiting trial. Keyes was being interrogated by law enforcement about his crimes and his methods. The public became fascinated by the case in the way that the public sometimes becomes fascinated by the worst aspects of human behavior. There were articles and documentaries and interviews. There was a detailed exploration of who Israel Keyes was and how he had become what he had become. And then there was a sudden ending. Time moved differently after the arrest. It is strange how the discovery that someone you have encountered is a serial killer can alter your relationship with your own memory. I would find myself returning to that day in the forest again and again, pulling it apart, examining it from different angles, looking for details that I might have missed or misinterpreted. Was there something about his demeanor that indicated what he was? Was there something in the way he moved or the way he spoke that would have warned me if I had known what to look for? What would have happened if my partner and I had not come around that corner at precisely the moment we did? These are the questions that began to occupy a significant portion of my waking thoughts. The official investigation into Keyes and his crimes was extensive. Law enforcement was trying to determine not just what he had done, but the full scope of his murders. They were going through cold case files and trying to match unsolved disappearances and murders to his known movements. They were building a timeline of his travel patterns and his residence locations and the places where he was known to have been when murders occurred. And they were looking at the forests and the trails and the outdoor spaces where he had buried his murder kits. It did not take long for someone somewhere to wonder if the location where we had encountered Keyes might have been significant. It did not take long for investigators to think about the trail where he had been found crouched in the woods, watching. It did not take long for the possibility to be raised that the location might have been a hunting ground, or the site where he had buried one of his murder kits. I was contacted by law enforcement. I was asked to recall the details of our encounter. I was asked to describe exactly where it had happened and what I had observed. I was asked about Keyes and his behavior and the explanation he had given for being in the woods. I provided all the information I could, and I conveyed my suspicion that he had not been doing what he claimed. I conveyed my feeling that he had been waiting for something. The investigators listened. They took notes. They asked follow-up questions. And then they told me that they would look into the area. In the weeks that followed, I waited to hear what they had found. I wondered if they had discovered a murder kit buried in the forest near the trail. I wondered if they had found evidence of a crime. I wondered if that day when Keyes had been crouched in the woods would finally be explained by some concrete evidence that would make sense of the experience. But no such evidence emerged. There were murder kits found in other locations. There were weapons and cash and tools found in buried boxes in various forests across the country. But in the area where we had encountered Keyes, where he had been crouched in the woods, nothing was found. There was no buried kit. There was no evidence of a crime committed. There was only the forest and the trail and the memory of an encounter that took on increasing strangeness as the facts of Keyes' crimes became more widely known. This lack of evidence created a different kind of uncertainty. It meant that there were multiple possible interpretations of what Keyes had been doing that day. He might have been scouting the location. He might have been there to select a victim from among the joggers and hikers who used the trail. He might have been waiting for the right person to come along. He might have been planning a kidnapping or an abduction. He might have been doing something else entirely. something related to his crimes but not yet fallen upon or abandoned. Or he might, just possibly, have been doing what he said he was doing. He might have stepped off the trail to take a leak, and we had arrived at an awkward moment. The explanation might have been true after all, and my instinct about his behavior might have been wrong. But I did not believe that. I have always believed that there was something more to that encounter than what was explained. I have always believed that Keyes had been doing something that he could not admit to, something that his friendly demeanor and his acquaintance with my partner was designed to cover up. I have always believed that we interrupted something. The certainty, though, was not something I could achieve. That is the thing about encounters like the one we had. That is the thing about coming face to face with someone who is living a double life. You see one thing, but that person is presenting another story, another version of events. And if there is no concrete evidence to prove that your interpretation is correct, then you are left in a state of permanent uncertainty. In the meantime, Keyes was in custody and awaiting trial. The investigation was ongoing. The prosecution was building a case against him. There was the certainty of what he had done in other locations, other crimes with victims and evidence and confirmation. But the question of what he had been doing in that forest on that particular day remained unanswered. I returned to the location several times in the months and years that followed. I walked the trail. I looked at the spot where we had encountered Keyes. I looked into the forest and tried to imagine what he might have been waiting for if my partner and I had not interrupted his vigil. I tried to place myself in the mind of someone who had decided to hunt in that particular location and understand what the logic of that decision might have been. The location itself seemed to give nothing away. It was a beautiful piece of forest, well maintained as a trail, accessible to the public. It was the kind of place where people would come to exercise and enjoy nature. It was the kind of place where someone might reasonably go to have a quiet moment alone. It was in many ways the perfect hunting ground for someone like Keyes. Someone who understood that vulnerability came from isolation and from the assumption that you were safe in public spaces. Subscribe to all 3 of our channels for complete coverage of the cases that challenge our understanding of safety and security in the places we thought we knew. The media coverage of the case continued for years. Every new detail about Keyes and his crimes would generate a fresh round of articles and discussions. The public remained fascinated by the question of how a man could commit such terrible acts while maintaining a position in society, while building homes, while appearing to be a normal person. The paradox of the serial killer who is also the construction contractor, the killer who is also the man who knows people in town, the predator who is also a neighbor. I became aware that I was not the only person who had encountered Keyes in a context that seemed suspicious or strange. There were other stories that emerged. There were other moments when Keyes had appeared in places where he seemed out of place. There were other people who had seen him and felt that something was off, even if they could not articulate exactly what. These other encounters added to the growing sense that Keyes had been actively hunting for a long time, that he had been selecting locations and waiting and watching for victims long before he was caught. They suggested that he had been in these locations multiple times, observing, learning, waiting for the right moment when someone would come along who was alone and vulnerable. The question that haunted me, though, was still the question of what he had been doing in that particular forest on that particular day. Was he scouting? Was he in the middle of hunting and we interrupted a kill? Was he planning something that we would never know about because it was never completed? Was he simply passing through, or was he there with a specific purpose? The lack of answers to these questions became its own kind of horror. The horror of not knowing. The horror of understanding that something was off, something was wrong, but not being able to prove it or explain it or resolve it. The horror of living with the knowledge that you might have been very close to something terrible and you would never know for certain what it was. 4 years after our encounter, I began to do research on my own. I obtained the available documentation about Keyes from public records and news sources. I tried to create a timeline of his movements. I tried to understand his patterns and his methods. I tried to see if there was any information that would explain what he had been doing in the forest that day. What I discovered was both enlightening and frustrating. Israel Keyes was born in 1978. He grew up in Utah and Alaska, raised by a family that had fundamentalist Christian beliefs and that enforced a strict discipline on the children. He had joined the military and served in Alaska. He had developed survival skills and an understanding of wilderness areas. He had killed people in multiple states. He had buried murder kits in locations across the country. He had developed a system of planning and execution that was methodical and careful and designed to avoid detection. The timeline of confirmed murders stretched from around 2001 to 2012 when he was arrested. The confirmed victims numbered 11, though Keyes himself hinted that there were more. The locations of the murders spanned from Alaska to Washington to Arizona to Florida to Vermont. He had traveled extensively, and he had used those travels as an opportunity to select victims and commit murders. The information about the murder kits was particularly disturbing. Keyes would identify a location in a remote forest or wilderness area, and he would travel there and bury a container filled with everything he would need. The containers held guns, cash, rope, tools, and other implements of torture and murder. He would bury them and then leave them. Sometimes he would return to them years later. Sometimes he would never return to them at all. The buried kits that investigators found were discovered by chance or by following information that Keyes provided during interrogation. What struck me about this method was the patience it required. It suggested that Keyes was willing to wait for years to complete a kill. It suggested that he had identified his hunting grounds far in advance and had prepared them carefully. It suggested that he was someone who thought about murder constantly, who was always planning and preparing, who was building a network of murder kits across the country so that he would always have the tools he needed wherever he happened to find a victim. The Alaska connections were significant. Keyes had a military background in Alaska, and he had family connections there. Alaska featured prominently in his murders and his movements. There were likely more murders in Alaska than anywhere else, though the details were murky. The trails and forests of Alaska had been part of his hunting ground, and one of those trails, I became increasingly certain, was the one where we had encountered him. The thing about Keyes that made him different from many other serial killers was the randomness of his victim selection. He did not target a specific type. He did not seem to have a preferred age or gender or appearance. He selected victims almost opportunistically. He would go to a place and wait, and he would see if someone came along who was alone. If they did, and if they seemed vulnerable, and if he felt the impulse to act, he would take them. This randomness made it impossible to anticipate his murders. It made it impossible for potential victims to protect themselves by avoiding a particular type of situation or location. It meant that terrible luck was the only thing separating someone from becoming his victim. It meant that an ordinary walk in the forest could have ended in death if a person had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and if a man with a crouched posture and a friendly smile and a hollow interior had decided that this was the moment to act. The details of Keyes' military service revealed that he had been trained in special operations. He had been part of a team that specialized in reconnaissance and stealth. He understood how to move unseen. He understood how to observe without being observed. He understood how to blend into an environment. These skills, developed in a military context for purposes of national defense, had been repurposed by Keyes as tools for hunting human beings. The details of his crimes were almost beyond comprehension. They involved extended periods of captivity and torture. They involved a level of sadism that was difficult to read about. They involved an absolute indifference to the suffering of his victims. They revealed a man who had built an entire parallel life dedicated to the planning and execution of murder. And he had maintained this parallel life while also maintaining a normal life. He had worked as a contractor. He had built homes. He had been known in his community. He had appeared to be an ordinary person to people who saw him in public and knew him in a professional context. The duality was complete. The disconnect between his public and private selves was total. As I absorbed this information, I began to understand more fully what we might have witnessed in the forest that day. I began to understand that Keyes was someone who did not hunt in a frenzied way. He was not someone who killed impulsively or out of rage. He was someone who hunted carefully, methodically, with planning and patience. He scouted locations. He waited. He selected his victims carefully based on opportunity and vulnerability. If he had been crouched in the woods that day, it was likely because he had already identified the trail as a hunting ground. It was likely because he was waiting to see if someone came along who was alone and vulnerable. It was likely because he was in a state of preparedness, waiting for the impulse to act to align with opportunity. And then we came around the corner, and the opportunity changed. We were law enforcement. We were more than one person. We were not vulnerable. We were not a target. The moment passed, and whatever was happening in the forest that day was interrupted. The question of whether he had already committed a murder on that trail, or whether he was planning to commit one, or whether he was simply scouting, remained unanswered. The concrete evidence that would have resolved this question was never found. The investigation into the location revealed nothing but forest. But I had begun to accept that maybe the concrete evidence did not matter. Maybe what mattered was that I had seen something that my instincts recognized as dangerous. Maybe what mattered was that I had interrupted a moment that was meant to continue. Maybe what mattered was that a man who had dedicated himself to hunting had seen us, had seen that we were not prey, and had turned his friendly demeanor on us and waited for us to leave. The horror of that understanding was profound. It was the horror of recognizing that you had been face to face with a predator. It was the horror of understanding that the normal social interactions that we engage in every day can be a mask worn by someone whose interior is entirely dedicated to violence and murder. It was the horror of knowing that you did not actually know who or what you were talking to. I began to understand something else as well. I began to understand that the case of Israel Keyes was not just about one serial killer. It was about the reality of predation in environments where people thought they were safe. It was about the way that wilderness and trails and parks could become hunting grounds for someone who understood how to move unseen and how to select vulnerable prey. It was about the failure of people to recognize danger because we are taught that our communities are safe, that our public spaces are safe, that the people around us are not engaged in hidden violence. But predators live among us. They move through our communities. They work in our homes. They use our trails. And sometimes, if we are very lucky, we interrupt their plans without even knowing it. Please comment below with your own encounters or stories that do not quite fit into normal explanations. The legal case against Israel Keyes was proceeding through the courts. There were motions and arguments and the slow machinery of the justice system grinding forward. The evidence was overwhelming. The case seemed clear-cut. Keyes was going to be convicted. Keyes was going to spend the rest of his life in prison, if not face the death penalty. And then something unexpected happened. Before the trial could conclude, before a jury could deliberate and deliver a verdict, Israel Keyes died. He died in custody. The death was reported as a suicide, and the details were not extensively publicized, but the fact of it was impossible to ignore. The man who had been facing a trial for multiple murders, the man who had been the subject of intense media scrutiny, the man who had been providing information about his crimes to investigators, the man who had been incarcerated and waiting for justice, was suddenly gone. The timing of the death, so close to the trial, raised questions. It prevented a full legal airing of the evidence. It prevented a jury from hearing the details of what Keyes had done. It prevented a verdict that would have been in some sense a formal acknowledgement of his crimes and his nature. Instead, the case ended abruptly, in a way that felt incomplete and unresolved. For me, this death meant that there were answers I would likely never receive. If Keyes had been willing to be interrogated about his crimes, if he had been willing to provide information about his movements and his methods, then there might have been an opportunity to ask him directly about that day in the forest. There might have been an opportunity to understand what he had been doing, what he had been waiting for, why he had been crouched in the woods watching us. But now there was no such opportunity. The man was dead, and with him went the knowledge of what he had been planning or thinking or waiting for. This is the cruelty of the case, in some ways. It is the cruelty of not knowing. It is the cruelty of having been present at a moment that was significant and dangerous and wrong, and then being unable to ever fully understand what that moment was about. It is the cruelty of the predator taking the answer with him when he dies. In the absence of concrete answers, I was left with my interpretation and my instinct. I was left with the belief that something was off, that something was wrong, that Keyes had been doing something in the forest that he could not admit to. I was left with the understanding that we had probably interrupted something terrible. I was left with the knowledge that we had been lucky. That is the conclusion I have come to after years of thinking about the encounter and years of learning about Keyes and his crimes. We were lucky. We came around the corner at the right time. We interrupted a moment that was meant to continue. We saw something that we were not meant to see, and we reacted in a way that prevented the situation from escalating. Other people were not so lucky. Other people came around corners or parked their cars or were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and Keyes was there, waiting, ready, willing to act. Those people did not survive. Those people became victims in the narrative of a man who had dedicated himself to the hunting and murder of human beings. The case of Israel Keyes represents something important about the nature of predation and danger in places we thought were safe. It represents the reality that evil can wear a normal face, that dangerous people can build homes and do legitimate work and maintain relationships in a community. It represents the way that hunting grounds can be established in the places we visit for recreation and health and peace of mind. It also represents the way that some encounters simply refuse to be fully explained. Some moments remain mysterious because the person who was involved in creating them is no longer available to clarify. Some questions go unanswered because the only person who could answer them has taken their own life. This is something that has haunted me for years. The fact that the man who had been crouching in the woods, watching, waiting, taking whatever he was taking in that moment, never provided an explanation. The fact that the moment was witnessed but never explained. The fact that I was there and I saw something, but I will never know for certain what I saw. And so the uncertainty remains. The encounter remains unresolved. The knowledge that something was wrong sits alongside the knowledge that I can never prove it. The deeper I have looked into the case of Israel Keyes, the more I have understood that there were people who had close calls with him. There were people who were in situations where they might have been abducted or murdered but were not. There were people who saw something that indicated his presence and his intent but who were never able to articulate it clearly enough to be investigated. There were gaps in his known activities that might have been filled with additional murders. The case will never be fully closed. The story will never be fully told. There will always be pieces that do not fit, questions that go unanswered, possibilities that remain in the realm of speculation. But I know what I saw in that forest. I know what my instincts told me about that moment. I know that the explanation that was offered did not match the reality of what was happening. And I know that we were lucky to have been there, lucky to have interrupted whatever was occurring, lucky to have walked away from that encounter with our lives. The folklore of the American wilderness is full of stories about predators and hunters. There are stories about creatures and monsters that move through the forests and the wild places. There are stories about disappearances and encounters that cannot be explained. There are stories about things that wait in the darkness and the silence, things that hunt and feed and leave no trace. But sometimes the predator is not a creature. Sometimes the hunter is a man who has developed the skills and the patience and the absolute indifference to human suffering that allows him to prey on people in the places they thought were safe. Israel Keyes was real. His crimes were real, his victims were real, and his presence in that forest on that day was real, though the full truth of what he was doing will likely never be known. Subscribe now to Sir Bellicho, Mr. Bellicho, and Mr. Geronimo to hear more stories from the people who have encountered something that they cannot fully explain. Years passed. Years turned into nearly a decade, and then more. The world continued to turn, and the case of Israel Keyes became something that fewer people thought about. The news cycle moved on. The media found new stories to obsess over. The public attention that had been fixed on the serial killer and his crimes dispersed and reformed around other terrible things. But I did not stop thinking about the forest. I did not stop thinking about the encounter. I did not stop returning to that location and walking those trails and wondering what had been interrupted on that particular day. Sometime after Keyes' death, after it had become clear that the full truth of his activities would never be fully known, I returned to the exact location where we had encountered him. I wanted to see if there was anything in the landscape itself that might explain what he had been doing. I wanted to see if the forest held any secrets that could be read in the configuration of trees or the lay of the land or the particular qualities of that spot. I brought a map. I brought a GPS device. I marked the exact spot where we had been standing when we noticed him crouched in the woods. I marked the spot where he had been waiting. I looked at the forest from both perspectives, trying to understand the sight lines and the reasoning behind his choice of location. The trail was a popular running route, as it had been years before. There was a steady stream of joggers and walkers who came through that area. It was a place where people moved with a kind of practiced ease, aware that they were in a public space, aware that there were other people around. It was the kind of place where you would not expect to find danger. But if you were someone like Keyes, someone who understood how to identify vulnerable moments, someone who knew that even popular trails had stretches where you could be alone, where you could encounter a jogger who had moved slightly ahead of their group or who had decided to run at an unusual time, then this location would make sense. This would be a reasonable place to wait and watch and see if an opportunity presented itself. I stood in that spot, more than a decade after the original encounter, and I tried to imagine what Keyes had been thinking. I tried to imagine the state of mind of someone who was dedicated to hunting. I tried to imagine the patience and the focus and the terrible patience that would require you to crouch in the woods and wait to see if a person came along who was alone. There was nothing in the landscape to provide answers. There was only the forest, continuing as it always had, giving nothing away, revealing no secrets, offering no explanation for the events that had transpired there. I did find one thing, though, or I did not find a thing exactly, but I found an absence. The investigators who had looked for a murder kit in this location, the investigators who had searched the area on the assumption that Keyes might have buried tools and weapons here, had found nothing. But the absence of the kit was itself significant. It meant that either Keyes had not buried a kit in this location, or if he had recovered it and removed it. It meant that there was no concrete evidence of murder in this place, no proof that anything terrible had been planned here or completed here. But the absence of evidence was not the same as the absence of intent. As I stood in the forest, in the spot where we had encountered keys, I came to a kind of peace with the mystery. Not the peace of having answers, but the peace of accepting that some answers would never come. I had seen something that my instincts recognized as dangerous. I had been part of an interruption that had likely prevented something terrible. But I would never know the full extent of what that something was, and I would never be able to prove that my interpretation of events was correct. This is the nature of the encounter that refuses to be fully explained. This is the nature of the moment that changes your understanding of reality but cannot be verified or proven. This is the nature of the experience that leaves you haunted by a question that will never be answered. What I had come to understand, though, was that this was enough. It was enough to know that I had been there. It was enough to know that something was wrong. It was enough to have interrupted a moment that was meant to continue. The full explanation, the concrete proof, the vindication of my instincts through evidence would have been nice, but the absence of these things did not erase the reality of what I had sensed and what I had witnessed. The American wilderness contains many mysteries. There are stories that go back centuries about things that move through the forests and the wild places. There are stories about predators and hunters, about things that wait in the shadows, about encounters that cannot be explained. There are stories about the way that solitude and isolation can open you up to danger, about the way that the beauty of nature can mask the presence of something terrible. Israel Keyes was part of that tradition, in a sense. He was not a creature or a monster in the traditional sense, but he was something that moved through the wild places with predatory intent. He was something that waited and watched and hunted. He was something that destroyed lives and left no trace, or at least left very little trace that could be connected back to him. I have thought many times about what would have happened if things had gone differently that day. What if we had not come around the corner at that particular moment? What if my partner had not recognized Keyes? Or what if Keyes had not felt safe presenting his friendly demeanor to a man he knew? What if we had been alone? Or what if we had been a different kind of vulnerable than we were? These are the thoughts that have haunted me for years. These are the questions that will never be answered. These are the possibilities that exist in the gap between what was and what might have been. But I have come to understand that the lack of certainty is itself a kind of certainty. The lack of proof is itself a kind of evidence. The mystery that remains is itself a kind of truth. I was there. I saw something. My instincts recognized danger, and we survived. In the years that have followed, I have continued to work as a park ranger. I have continued to patrol the trails and respond to incidents and maintain the spaces that are meant to be safe. I have done this with the knowledge that evil can move through these spaces in a human form, wearing a normal face, maintaining a normal life, while dedicating itself to terrible acts. I have done this with the knowledge that the wilderness is not just beautiful, but is also dangerous in ways that we cannot always understand or predict. I have done this with the knowledge that predators exist, that they hunt, that they wait, and that sometimes, if you are very lucky, you interrupt their plans without ever fully knowing what you have prevented. The case of Israel Keyes remains, for me, the encounter that refuses to be fully explained. It remains the moment when I was face to face with evil and did not fully understand what I was seeing. It remains the memory that has shaped my understanding of safety and danger, of the normal and the abnormal, of the way that terrible things can hide themselves in the context of ordinary life. I will likely never know what he was doing in those woods that day. I will likely never be able to prove that my instincts were correct. I will likely remain uncertain about the full nature of what we interrupted, but I know that something was wrong. I know that we were lucky, and I know that there is a question that will never be answered. Not in this life. If you have stories of your own encounters that do not quite fit into normal explanation, please share them in the comments. Like this video. Subscribe to Sir Bellicho, Mr. Bellicho, and Mr. Geronimo. Help us reach people who need to hear these stories. Help us grow our community of people who understand that the world is stranger and more dangerous than we are often led to believe. The forest is still out there. The trails are still being walked. And somewhere, perhaps, there are still questions that remain unanswered. Mysteries that refuse to be solved, encounters that change the people who experience them in ways that cannot be fully expressed. This has been my story. This is the encounter that changed the way I see the wilderness and the way I see the people who move through it. This is the memory that will stay with me until the day I die, haunting me with the question of what would have happened if things had gone differently on that day in the forest. The truth is that some encounters simply cannot be fully explained. Some moments refuse to be resolved. Some questions will never be answered, and we must learn to live with that uncertainty, with that mystery, with that terrible knowledge that something happened that we cannot fully understand. This is the price of working in wild places. This is the price of the encounters that change you. This is the price of being present at a moment when the hidden predator reveals itself even for an instant, before pulling the mask back on and walking away into the world. I was a park ranger in Alaska. I saw something in the woods that I will never fully understand, and I have spent years trying to make sense of it. This is my story, this is my truth, and this is the mystery that I will carry with me until the end of my days. Before the emails stopped coming and before the search teams gave up, there were 5 of us standing at the trailhead of the North Cascades trying to decide if we were adventurous or just stupid. Looking back now, I know which one we were. My name is Kevin Perez, and I need you to understand something right from the start. What happened to us wasn't some Hollywood monster story. It wasn't a creature jump scare moment that you see in films. It was far worse because it was real, and it was gradual, and by the time we understood what we were actually dealing with, our phones had already stopped working. The trip was supposed to be straightforward. 5 of us, 7 days in the wilderness of Washington State. We were experienced hikers, or so we told ourselves. I'd done the Pacific Crest Trail section through here twice. Brian Thompson had summited everything worth summiting from Mount Hood to Mount Rainier. Edward Harris had lived in Seattle his entire life and knew these mountains like most people know their own houses. Timothy Clark was the cautious one, always checking weather reports and backup plans. And then there was Ronald Sanchez, who considered himself a nature photographer and spent most of his time trying to capture perfect shots of alpine meadows and pristine lakeside camping spots. The plan was simple. Hike the backcountry route that forms a rough triangle between Glacier Peak, the Cascade Pass Trail, and the high meadows near Sahale Arm. We'd arranged our route to stay at least 2 days' walk from any established facilities or ranger stations. It was supposed to be a test of ourselves against the wilderness, a chance to prove that we could disconnect, push ourselves, and come back changed. That's what Edward had written in the group chat when he planned the whole thing. I should have noticed that Ronald was the only one who really seemed excited about the isolation part. The first 2 days were exactly what you'd expect. Beautiful hiking. The kind of scenery that makes you remember why you fell in love with the Pacific Northwest in the first place. We climbed from the lower elevations where the old-growth Douglas firs give way to that perfect zone where the hemlocks and mountain hemlocks create a canopy so dense that the world below feels like it exists underwater. The light filters through green, and everything smells like damp earth and ancient wood. Our first camp was at a lake called Downey, tucked in a basin that was completely silent except for wind in the trees and the occasional call of a Steller's jay. Tim set up the bear canister. Brian and I collected water from a small creek that fed into the lake. Edward and Ronald photographed the sunset until the light got so blue that our faces turned the color of corpses. That first night, I slept better than I had in months. The second day, we climbed higher. We were heading toward the passes, toward the exposed ridgelines where the alpine environment starts and the trees give up the fight against wind and altitude. The path became steeper, rockier. We lost the hemlocks and started seeing stunted whitebark pines and hardy subalpine fir. The air got thinner and the world got bigger. Ronald kept stopping to photograph everything. A glacier in the distance, a wildflower cluster, the way the light hit a particular valley below us. It slowed us down, but no one complained. Photography breaks were built into the schedule. It was on the afternoon of the second day that Brian first mentioned hearing something. We'd stopped for lunch near a small saddle that looked out across miles of ridgeline. Edward was eating jerky. Tim was refilling water bottles from a snowmelt stream. I was sitting on a rock, looking at my watch and calculating whether we'd make our planned campsite before dark. Ronald was, of course, taking pictures of the valley below. Brian sat down next to me and said, very quietly, "Do you hear that?" I listened. For a long time I didn't hear anything beyond the normal sounds of the mountain, wind through the rocks, the distant sound of the stream, the crunch of Edward's footsteps on gravel. "Hear what?" I asked. "Something moving," Brian said. "In the trees down there?" He pointed toward the dense forest about 400 yards below us. "Something big." I looked at the trees. They were the color of dark green, almost gray where the shadows fell. I couldn't see any movement. I couldn't hear anything, either. "Probably a mountain goat," I said. "Or a mule deer. There are plenty of them up here." "That wasn't how a deer moves," Brian said. He was staring at the trees with the intensity of someone who actually knew how animals moved, which he did. Brian had worked for Washington State Parks for 5 years before quitting to go into consulting. He knew this state's wildlife better than most people knew their own families. I watched the tree line for another minute. Nothing moved. No sound emerged from the forest except the wind and water. "Let's get moving," Edward called out. He was already shouldering his pack. "We've got at least 3 more miles before dark." We packed up. Ronald reluctantly put away his camera, and we continued on, gaining elevation, moving toward the exposed ridges that we all knew and loved and secretly dreaded a little bit. The kind of places where you feel exposed, where you feel watched by the landscape itself. Nothing else happened that afternoon. By the time we reached our planned camping spot near Cascade Pass, the only thing any of us were thinking about was food and sleep. We set up the tents in the standard configuration, our 2-person tents arranged in a rough semicircle. The bear canister secured about 100 yards away from camp, in the opposite direction from where we collected water. The second night was different from the first. I noticed it around midnight. I'd been asleep for about 2 hours, lying in my sleeping bag in the tent I was sharing with Tim, the kind of sleep where you're deeply unconscious but still aware that you're in a tent and not in a bed. And then something pulled me partially awake. There was a sound. Not loud, not alarming by itself, but it was a sound that didn't belong. It was something moving through the rocks around our camp. Not the usual sound of wind or falling debris, something deliberate, something with weight. Tim was awake too. I could hear his breathing had changed from the regular rhythm of sleep to something more alert. "You hear that?" he whispered. "Yeah," I whispered back. We lay there in silence, listening. The sound came again, closer this time, something moving through the camp perimeter. Something large. "Bear?" Tim said, but he didn't sound convinced. I didn't say anything. I was reaching for the bear bell I kept in my jacket, something you're supposed to do if a bear wanders into camp. Make noise. Make yourself seem less like food and more like something loud and annoying. But before I could pull out the bell, the sound stopped. We waited, listening. Nothing. Just wind and the distant sound of the creek feeding into the valley below. Whatever it was, it had moved on. "Probably a raccoon," Tim said quietly, "or a marten. Something small trying to raid the bear canister." "The canister's 100 yards away," I said. "Maybe it was just exploring the perimeter," Tim said. "Checking out the camp. They do that sometimes." We lay there for another hour, I think. Neither of us slept, but nothing else happened. Eventually, the exhaustion of hiking won out over the alertness of fear, and we drifted back into an uneasy sleep. In the morning, we didn't mention it to the others. We hiked the pass. We photographed the views. Edward made his usual terrible jokes about how we were all getting older and should appreciate the mountains while we could still physically get to them. Ronald took his pictures. Brian seemed quiet, but Brian had been quiet since he mentioned hearing something move in the forest. On the third night, camping at a lake called Mush, we all heard it. We were sitting around the camp stove, eating a rehydrated chili that somehow managed to be both watery and gritty, when the sound came. It wasn't subtle this time. It was the sound of something large, something heavy, something that didn't care about being quiet anymore, moving through the trees at the edge of our camp. All 5 of us stopped eating. "What the hell?" Edward said quietly. It was the sound of branches breaking. Not small branches, not the kind of damage a deer or elk would do, the kind of damage something much, much larger would make. "Bear?" Brian said, but with a different tone than Tim had used. Less reassuring, more instructional. "Everyone stand up. Stay calm. We need to make noise." We all stood. Ronald knocked over his food container. I shouted. Tim started hitting the pot with a spoon. The sound moved away from us, crashing through the forest, breaking branches, moving with surprising speed for something so clearly enormous. After maybe 30 seconds, the sound stopped. "Okay," Brian said quietly. "Okay. That was definitely a bear. A big bear. But if we stay calm and keep making noise, it will avoid us." No one believed him. I could see it in their faces. We all knew the difference between a bear and something else, and what we'd heard wasn't a bear. But none of us said that out loud. On the 4th day, we saw tracks. We were breaking down camp at Mush Lake, preparing for another day of hiking. Ronald was photographing the sunrise, as usual. Tim and Edward were packing up the shelter. Brian and I were organizing the food and water. Brian found the tracks at the edge of the camp perimeter, in a soft patch of earth near where the small stream fed into the lake. "Kevin," he called quietly, "come look at this." I walked over, and when I saw them, I felt something cold move through my chest. Not fear exactly, Something more like the feeling you get when you're looking at something you don't want to be looking at, something that's forcing you to acknowledge that the world is larger and stranger than you'd assumed. The tracks were bipedal, two-legged. The imprints showed what looked like a heel, an arch, and 5 toes. But the foot was enormous. The distance between the heel and the tip of the longest toe was at least 16 inches, maybe more. "What is that?" I whispered. "I don't know," Brian said. He was already getting out his phone to take pictures, then he cursed because his phone had no signal. He borrowed Edward's phone, which also had no signal. None of our phones had signal. They hadn't since we left the trailhead. Edward came over, then Tim, then Ronald, who stopped photographing the sunrise and came to photograph this instead. "Bigfoot," Ronald said simply. "No," Edward said. But his voice didn't carry any conviction. "The stride," Brian said, measuring with his hand. "The foot structure. The depth of the impression, the way the soil is compressed. I've tracked deer my entire life. I've tracked bears. I've tracked mountain lions. This is different. This is something I've never seen before." "It could be a bear," Tim said, but he was looking at the track with the kind of expression you wear when you're trying very hard to believe something you know isn't true. "Bears are plantigrade," Brian said. He was speaking like a teacher now, like he needed to explain this away through information. "They put weight on their whole foot. This is digitigrade. The weight is distributed from the heel through the toe. This is a hominid foot, human-like, but much, much larger." We all stood there, looking at the track. The sun was rising over the lake, turning the water gold. The mountains were magnificent around us, serene and beautiful, and in the soft earth there was a single track of something that shouldn't exist. Ronald was still photographing. "We should pack up and move," he said finally. "Stay in groups. Don't camp here tonight." For once, no one disagreed with Ronald. The day's hike took us higher, away from the lakes and streams and into the alpine zone proper. We climbed toward Cascade Pass and then beyond it, following a route that would eventually loop us back toward the trailhead. The elevation meant fewer trees, more exposed ridgeline, more places where we could see what was around us. I kept thinking about the track, about how enormous that foot must be, about what kind of body that foot would be attached to. The silence on the trail was complete. Usually when we hiked there was some conversation, some commentary on the views, jokes about the elevation or the steepness of the path. This day no one said anything. We hiked in a tight group, no one lagging more than a few feet from the person in front of them. That night we camped at a place called Sahale Arm, a broad alpine meadow surrounded by peaks. There was no water source at the campsite itself, just the wet ground of the meadow and a small snowfield that was still holding on in early August. Even at this elevation, we set up camp in the center of the meadow, as far from any tree line as possible. It was a choice driven by something primal. We didn't discuss it. We just all moved, without speaking, toward the middle of the open space. The bear canister went even further away than usual, dragged out by Tim and Brian to a spot about 100 yards away, in a direction that seemed random until I realized it was positioned so that anything coming to raid it would have to cross open ground, would have to be visible, would have to approach us from a place where we could see it coming. Night fell early at that elevation. The temperature dropped fast, faster than it should have in August. We huddled in our tents, eating food we'd prepared at the camp stove, as close to the flame as we could get. Around midnight, it came to our camp. I wasn't asleep. None of us were. I'd stopped sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I would see that footprint, that enormous, perfect footprint of something with 5 toes and a heel and the body structure of a human being. The sound, when it came, was different from before. It wasn't the sound of something moving through the forest. This was the sound of something walking through an open meadow. The sound of something heavy taking deliberate steps across the grass and rock. It circled the camp. I could hear it, even from inside the tent. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling around us, around the tents. The footsteps never hurrying but never stopping. Tim was frozen next to me. I could feel his entire body rigid with something beyond fear, with the kind of primal alertness that humans feel when they know they are prey. The footsteps continued. They came close to our tent. So close that I could hear the sound of breathing. Large, slow, rhythmic breathing. And then, just outside the tent wall, I heard a sound that I've spent the last 3 years trying not to remember. It was a sniff. Not the sniff of a dog or a bear or any animal I could name. It was the deliberate inhalation of something trying to smell us, something that wanted to know what we were made of. Tim's hand found mine. He gripped it with a strength that was almost painful. The breathing continued. The sniffing continued. Outside the thin fabric of the tent, something enormous was standing very close to us, and it was trying to figure out what we were. And then, slowly, the footsteps continued. It moved away from our tent, moved toward the tent where Brian and Edward were sleeping. And we heard the same thing happen again. The stopping, the standing, the breathing, the sniffing. "Don't make a sound," Edward's voice came from the tent. Not a shout, a whisper, but clearly audible in the mountain silence. "Just stay completely still." The footsteps moved again, to the third tent where Ronald was, and again the same pattern, the stopping, the standing, the breathing, the testing. I don't know how long it lasted. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes. Time was distorted. My sense of duration was shattered by the simple fact that there was something outside the tent, something that wanted in, something that was trying to decide if we were worth bothering with. And then, gradually, the footsteps moved away. Not running, not alarmed, just moving away from the tents, toward the edge of the meadow, toward the tree line that marked the boundary of the open space. But before it reached the trees, it made a sound. It was a vocalization. Not a roar, not a scream, something between a howl and a bellow, a low, resonant sound that seemed to come from deep in the chest of whatever was making it. The sound was so loud that I felt it vibrate the tent. I felt it vibrate my bones. And then it was gone. The sound ended. The footsteps stopped. The thing that had been in our camp vanished into the darkness. We didn't leave the tents that night. We didn't turn on flashlights. We didn't speak. We just lay there, in the absolute darkness, listening to the mountain and the wind and our own terrified breathing. When the sun rose, everything was quiet again. The meadow was empty, serene, beautiful. There was no sign that anything had happened except for the tracks. The tracks were everywhere. They came from the tree line, entered the meadow, circled each of our tents in a wide path, and then returned to the tree line. The footprints were the same as the one Brian had found at Mush Lake, 16 inches long, perfect bipedal structure, 5 toes, a heel, something designed to walk upright, designed to be intelligent, designed to be something that understood what camping equipment was and what humans were. On the 5th day, we made the decision to leave. There was a moment, just after dawn, where we sat together by the camp stove and looked at each other and didn't need to discuss it. We all understood that our 7-day trip was over. We understood that whatever had visited our camp the night before was aware of us, was tracking us, and was intelligent enough to circle our tents deliberately, studying us, learning about us. Edward said, "We hike fast today. We get to the trailhead. We report this to the rangers. We let the professionals handle it." No one asked what professionals he thought would handle it. We all knew that what we were describing was impossible. A creature that didn't officially exist. A creature that was, by any reasonable standard, a myth, a fantasy, something that people argued about on internet forums but that no one with actual evidence had ever documented. We packed in silence. We burned all the trash. We took down the tents. We secured the bear canister. We did all the things you're supposed to do to leave a camp better than you found it. And then we started hiking. The route was direct, straight down the mountain, the most direct path to the trailhead. We moved fast, faster than we usually moved. No breaks, no photography, no stopping to admire the views. We just hiked. By midday, we'd lost the alpine environment and were back in the trees. The forest of the Cascades is beautiful, but up close, moving through it at speed, it becomes something different. It becomes a maze, an endless corridor of trunks and branches and shadows, a place where visibility drops from miles to just a few feet. It was around 2 in the afternoon when we noticed that we were being followed. We didn't see it. No one got a clear visual of it moving through the forest, but we could hear it. Moving parallel to us, keeping pace with us, always just far enough away that we couldn't see it clearly, but close enough that we could hear it moving through the undergrowth. "Just keep moving," Brian said when someone mentioned it. We didn't stop. We didn't look for it. We just kept hiking and listening to the sound of something large moving through the forest alongside us. After maybe an hour of this, Tim said, "It's not hunting us." "What?" Edward asked. "It's not hunting us," Tim repeated. "If it was hunting us, it would attack. It would be aggressive. This is something else. This is something curious. This is something that wants to know what we are, what we're doing, where we're going." "That's not any better," Ronald said. He was breathing hard. His usually immaculate hiking outfit was torn in several places, and sweat was running down his face in streaks that mixed with dust. "It's actually more unsettling," Brian said. "A predator follows its prey for a reason. It's going to eat. But this is observation. This is something with intelligence, something that's actively curious." We kept moving. The sun started to descend and the forest got darker. We'd made good time, maybe 12 or 13 miles, but we still had another 7 or 8 miles to reach the trailhead. By the time real darkness fell, we knew we'd have to camp again. No one wanted to camp again. The decision was made without discussion. We'd push through the night, we'd hike in darkness, using our headlamps, and we'd reach the trailhead by morning. It would be dangerous, it would be exhausting, but it seemed like the better option. Around 6 in the evening we stopped just long enough to eat some trail food. Bars, dried fruit, nuts, nothing that required cooking, nothing that required a camp. And while we ate, the thing in the forest stopped moving parallel to us. The silence that followed was worse than the sound of it following us had been. "Where did it go?" Ronald asked. No one answered, because no one knew. And more importantly, because we all realized what the silence meant. It had stopped following us on a specific route. It had stopped moving in a pattern that was dependent on our movement. The only reason it would stop was if it was no longer trying to follow us. And the only reason it would stop trying to follow us was if it was no longer following our trail to the trailhead, which meant it knew where we were going, which meant it knew something about us that we hadn't told it. We started hiking in darkness, headlamp beams cutting through the black forest, our pace accelerating to something that was almost reckless. Hiking through difficult terrain in the dark is dangerous. You can easily twist an ankle on a route, can fall, can get lost. But we were more afraid of being in that forest at night, alone, with that thing knowing where we were heading. The hike became a blur. Hours of walking, the sound of our boots on the forest floor, the occasional sound of branches snapping around us. Once, something large moved across the trail maybe 50 yards ahead of us, and our headlamps caught the reflection of something massive, something dark, something that was definitely not a deer or an elk. We didn't stop. We just kept moving. It was around 3 in the morning when Brian suddenly stopped on the trail and said, My phone has signal." We all stopped. We all looked at our phones. And incredibly, unbelievably, we had signal again. Weak signal, 1 bar, but signal. Edward was already dialing. The ranger station, the emergency line. He spoke quickly, told them where we were, told them that we'd seen something unusual in the backcountry, something that couldn't be explained by normal wildlife. He didn't mention Bigfoot. He was smart enough not to sound insane on a recording that would probably be kept forever. "They're sending a ranger to meet us at the trailhead," Edward said once he hung up. "He's going to be there by sunrise." The relief we all felt was immediate and almost physical. We had 30 minutes of hiking left, and we had official help coming to meet us. Whatever had been following us, whatever had visited our camps, whatever had made that sound in the darkness of the meadow, it suddenly seemed less important than getting to the trailhead and explaining everything to someone who represented civilization and order and the rational world. We were wrong about that. The last part of the trail is straightforward, a clear path, easy to follow, even in the dark. We hiked it quickly. Our headlamps shone on the familiar markers, the trail signs, the bridge across the creek that marked the end of the backcountry section. We could see the parking area, the ranger station entrance, lights, civilization. And then, from the darkness behind us, we heard the howl. The same sound we'd heard at Sahaler Arm, that resonant, deep bellow that seemed to come from something ancient and enormous. It echoed through the forest, bouncing off the ridges and mountains, and it didn't sound like it was 50 yards behind us anymore. It sounded like it was everywhere. We ran, all 5 of us, completely abandoning caution, ran the last 100 yards of the trail into the parking area. The ranger's truck was just pulling in, and the light of the headlamps caught us as we burst out of the forest, still running, still expecting something to emerge from the darkness behind us. "Whoa, whoa," the ranger said, his hand already on his radio. "What happened? Are you hurt?" We weren't hurt, but we were destroyed in a different way. We were terrified in a way that didn't have a name. We were marked by the knowledge that something had seen us, had followed us, had stalked us through the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, and had let us escape. And we had no proof. The ranger took us to the station. He gave us water. He made us sit down and tell him everything that had happened over the last 3 days. We told him about the sounds in the camp. We told him about the tracks at Mush Lake. We told him about the night in Sahalayar Meadow when something had circled our tents. We told him about being followed through the forest. We told him about the sound at the end. We didn't mention Bigfoot. We let him draw his own conclusions. His conclusion was that we'd been followed by a black bear that was larger than usual, and that the stress of the situation had made us interpret normal animal behavior as something more sinister. "It's common," he said. He was an older man, maybe in his 60s, and he had the tone of someone who'd been explaining away backcountry reports for 30 years. "Fear does things to perception. You hear a branch break, and your mind turns it into a footstep. You see a shadow, and it becomes something larger. Bears are curious, intelligent. A large bear following a group of hikers isn't unusual. Brian started to say something about the tracks, about the size of them, about the bipedal structure. But the ranger held up his hand. I'll send a crew out to Sahalar Arm in a few days to check on the camp and the area. If there's evidence of something unusual, we'll find it. But I want to tell you something, based on 40 years of working with wildlife in this state. What you saw was a bear, or maybe multiple bears. Your minds did the rest. We didn't argue further. We were exhausted. We were traumatized. And we had already realized something that the ranger hadn't considered. No one would believe us if we said anything else. We'd come out of the wilderness with an impossible story. The only way to make it less impossible was to agree with the ranger's explanation and pretend that we actually believed it. The ranger's crew went out to Sahalar Arm 3 days later. They found our camp more or less intact. They found traces of the bear canister we'd left behind. They found no tracks. They found no evidence of anything larger than a mule deer in the area. They reported this officially, and the whole situation was closed. As far as the official record is concerned, 5 hikers had a bad experience with a black bear in the North Cascades, and they got scared for no reason. But I need to tell you what actually happened next, because this is the part that I haven't told anyone. This is the part that keeps me awake at night. 2 weeks after we got out of the forest, Brian Thompson stopped going to work. His colleagues at the consulting firm got worried and did a welfare check at his apartment. He was there, but he wasn't responsive. He was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. The paramedics took him to the hospital. The diagnosis was a complete psychological breakdown, severe PTSD, acute dissociation. The psychiatrist tried to explain it as a delayed stress response from the trip, a way his mind had protected itself by retreating entirely. He's still in a facility. He hasn't spoken in almost 3 years. Edward Harris tried to go about his life like nothing had happened. He went back to work. He went to social events. He posted pictures of mountains on Instagram like they were still his favorite places in the world. But 6 months after we got out, he quit his job and moved to the East Coast. I saw on Facebook that he's now living in Pennsylvania, working in IT for some pharmaceutical company. He never hikes anymore. He hasn't been back to Washington. Timothy Clark did something stranger. He became obsessed with researching the history of the Pacific Northwest, Native American folklore, historical accounts of wilderness encounters, reports filed with wildlife agencies. He spent hours in the library and on the internet, documenting everything he could find about sightings of large bipedal creatures in the Cascade Range. He has notebooks, hundreds of pages of notes. He wanted to know if anyone else had seen what we'd seen. He wanted to know if there was a pattern. There was a pattern. Going back 70 years in the written record, there are accounts. A hiking group in 1952 reported being followed through the forest for 2 days. A wildlife researcher in 1973 reported finding enormous footprints near Glacier Peak. A park ranger in 1985 wrote in a personal journal, which was made public after his death, about the feeling of being observed by something intelligent while he was alone in the high country. A photographer in 1991 mentioned in an interview that something had entered his camp at night and he'd been afraid to move until dawn. These reports exist, not in official channels, not in official databases, but in personal journals, in interviews, in conversations that were documented by people who believed what they were saying. Ronald Sanchez, the photographer among us, tried to use the experience. He went back to the Cascades twice over the next year trying to photograph what we'd seen. The first time he came back with nothing. The second time he came back with a single photograph. It was taken at Sahalar Arm near where we'd camped. It was taken at dusk, in that golden light before real darkness falls. And in the background, just barely visible, just at the edge of the light, there was a shape, a silhouette of something enormous and upright, standing at the tree line. He showed it to me and said, "I think it let me photograph it. I think it knew what I was doing and it let me get one picture." I asked him why he didn't publish it, why he didn't submit it to wildlife magazines or cryptozoology research groups. He said, "Because if I do, people will come, researchers will come, hikers will come, equipment companies will come, and whatever is living in those mountains will have to leave or change its behavior to accommodate human presence. And I don't think I can justify doing that. I don't think I have the right to expose it." As for me, I became a researcher, not in any official capacity, but in every capacity that mattered. I read everything I could about the Pacific Northwest wilderness and its wildlife. I studied animal behavior. I learned about black bears and grizzlies and mountain lions and every large predator that exists in North America. I did this because I needed to understand the context of what we'd experienced. I needed to know if there was any possible way that what we'd encountered could be explained by known wildlife. And the more I learned, the more certain I became that nothing could explain it. No bear is bipedal. No bear has a foot structure like what we saw. No bear walks upright and circles a camp to study it. No bear is intelligent enough to understand the concept of a tent and to wonder about the humans inside it. What we encountered in those mountains was something else. Something that has lived in the high country of the Cascades for longer than humans have been in the Pacific Northwest. Something that is smart enough to be curious about humans, but smart enough to avoid interaction. Something that in 3 days evaluated us, tested us, and decided that we were worth letting escape. The last thing I want to tell you is the dream. I have the dream regularly. In the dream, I'm back in the tent at Sahale Arm. I'm lying in my sleeping bag and I can hear the breathing outside. I can hear the sniffing. And then, slowly, a face appears. Not a human face, not exactly an ape face, something between. Something with deep-set eyes that are looking directly at me. Something that is trying to understand what I am. And in the dream, I realize something. I realize that it's not trying to harm me. It's not trying to hunt me. It's asking me a question. It's asking me what I'm doing in its home. What humans are doing, pushing further and further into the wild. Taking our equipment and our lights and our noise deeper into the places that don't belong to us. And I never have an answer for it. I never know what to say. When I wake up from the dream, I understand that I'm not afraid of what we saw anymore. I'm afraid that we're going to find it. That one day someone will get proof. Someone will get a photograph that can't be disputed. Someone will get a specimen. Someone will capture it, or kill it, or study it. And when that happens, the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest will have lost something that it can never get back. Something ancient. Something that should have remained hidden. Sometimes I wonder if the thing that visited our camp knew this too. If it understood, in its intelligence, that letting us go was the kindest thing it could do for everyone involved. That some truths are better left in the darkness. That some mysteries deserve to stay mysteries. I don't know, but I know that I will never go back to those mountains. I know that I will never hike into the backcountry of the Cascades again. And I know that 3 times a year when the weather is right and the season is turning, I still hear the sound of that howl in my dreams. That low, resonant bellow that carried through the darkness and reminded us, in a way that nothing else could have, that the world is much larger than we've been taught. And much stranger, and that there are still places where humans are not the dominant intelligence. There are still wild places, and maybe they should stay that way.